people are often worried that cross-platform like Flutter will make native obsolete. Do you think this is a worry that's justified?
Here's an important thought to me that came to me a couple of years ago. I was listening to, I think, Elon Musk on Joe Rogan or something like that, and he said something which made me realize what is stopping the floodgate of cross-platform development.
In this episode of the Coding in Flow podcast, I will be talking to Ryan Kay, aka WiseAss. Many of you know Ryan from his live streams on YouTube, where he teaches not only programming concepts, but also talks about productivity and life in general. Ryan has great knowledge about software architecture and computer science in general, and he really focuses on learning the low-level concepts of programming. For example, he is currently building his own programming language and he has built his own compiler. And Ryan is really able to think outside the box. He doesn't just blindly follow the theory that's taught by someone else just because they say so. Instead, he always tries to draw his own conclusions and he likes to experiment a lot. And even though it looks like this comes easy and natural to him, he actually had a hard time getting into programming. When he had programming classes in high school, he felt untalented. He couldn't really understand the concepts, and he even got declined for college. And in this episode, we will talk about how to teach yourself programming effectively, even if you don't feel smart enough. We will talk about some technical topics like how to choose the correct architecture for your app. We will talk about Jetpack Compose, cross-platform solutions like KMM and Flutter, and some other topics. And we will also touch on the topic of mental health and productivity. So this is a really nice episode. It's also a really long episode. So I recommend that you grab a cup of coffee or tea and lean back and just enjoy it. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsor for this episode, which is the Stream Chat SDK. Stream makes it super easy to implement a live chat into your app with features like group chats, attachments, reactions, offline support, and much more. I've tried to build a chat like this from scratch before and ended up quitting because it's actually really tricky to get everything right. With Stream, all these features work right out of the box. You can have a fully fledged chat app running in no time, which you can then customize the way you want. And the best thing, it's free if you're making less than $10,000 in monthly revenue and have less than 5 team members. You can use it on Android with Kotlin or Java, XML or Jetpack Compose, and it also supports many other platforms and languages. If I wanted to build a chat app today, Stream would be my first choice. So click the link in the description to find out more or visit getstream.io/codinginflow. Okay, Ryan, so my first question is, what's up with the name WiseAss? Why did you pick that name? And some people on Twitter asked if you even regret it now.
Yeah, someone in particular asked that. So basically, you have to understand that when I created that name, it was way back in 2016. And back then, I was a pretty angry kid. Like, I had just dropped out of college. I only did 1 semester, 3 courses in college. So I was pretty angry just from my upbringing and also very disillusioned with academia. So the name, I guess, makes a little bit more sense if you see the logo, which is basically a donkey wearing a graduation hat, hence WiseAss. So it's kind of a double meaning. On one hand, it's sort of like poking fun at academia, obviously, implying donkeys, and kind of implying that I don't really care if you have a certificate or a piece of paper that says you're good at something. But with that being said, I do respect people who, push through and get their certifications. But I really felt like just due to barriers of wealth and things like that, upbringing, and just not really having my crap together as a kid and as a teenager, post-secondary education was just not something that was really for me. And I was pretty angry about that. Now, as far as if I regret it or not, I really don't regret any of the things I do. I do regret some things. I regret when I lie. I regret when I'm mean to someone. But as far as like the name and choosing it, it made a lot of sense at the time. I would say the one good thing about it is it's provocative, not that I really try to be provocative. And ultimately at this point, it's an established brand name, which I do have plans for. So yeah, basically that's where the name comes from.
Yeah, it's not that I find the name bad when I say regret, but more what I imagine is that it could make some problems. For example, S is a swear word, and I don't know if YouTube maybe even has problems with that if you say that in your video. Maybe you can't put ads on there or something. Did you have any problems with that?
Not so far, but hey, if it is a problem, then probably they demonetize most of my videos.
Yeah, but I think you can actually swear a little bit on YouTube as long as it's not in the first like half minute or something like that. They have special words for the first few seconds. You should not swear more than 2 times, I think, in the first half minute or so. And then they're actually pretty okay with swearing as long as you don't do anything real bad like racial slurs or stuff like that. So saying S in your video should actually be fine and still give you a full monetization.
Oh, that's great because I come from kind of a working class background, and before I was able to do programming and teaching full time, I worked in construction crews and kitchens and places like that where swearing is as common as breathing. So it's been a bit of an adjustment, but I'm doing my best here today. But that's a totally fair statement, and also for some of the ESL people listening, wise ass is a specific term, and it's not something you want to be considered. A wise ass is someone who sort of thinks they're probably smarter than they are, and they're always trying to prove it. And so probably there are some sort of negative connotations and results from choosing that name. But I have this weird thing about making things harder for myself, like being really terrible at editing and video production and still trying to be good at YouTube. So it's just kind of a running theme in my life.
Yeah, you already mentioned a little bit that you had more of a difficult journey when it comes to learning programming, right? And I also read your bio on your blog where you, if I understood it correctly, you had programming classes in high school, but you felt untalented. Is that correct? And you also, if I understood it correctly, did not get accepted to college for computer science?
Yes, that's all correct. My first kind of experience programming was in high school in what were my senior years. So here in Canada, that would be grade 11 and grade 12. So to be honest, like what got me into it is that I grew up sort of using computers since I was 7. I think the first operating system I used was like Windows 95 for a couple weeks, and then we bumped it up to 97, I think. But
98,
98, thank you. So I'd been using computers from a young age, and but mostly just gaming and messing around. So my idea of programming was literally like the Matrix with like the green characters streaming down the monitors. So I thought, okay, this must be something that's impossibly difficult. But really, I just wanted to understand, like, how do you actually get like a window to show up like a dialog box or anything like that? Obviously, I didn't even know that it was called a dialog box. So, and then another part of it is I really just kind of wanted to see if I was smart enough to code. And I didn't think I was at the time. So for the first semester, we did Visual Basic, basically like Windows applications. And I sucked at it. Like I was terrible. There's a number of things that I remember clearly. So for starters, I was the worst in class. There was only about 5 people coding, but the other kids there were probably a little bit deeper into the spectrum than I am. And they were all like pretty naturally good at coding. So I remember the first application or significant application I wrote was like a card memory game, obviously with like a deck of playing cards, 52 cards. And I remember at the time, I just could not understand loops. I'd like figured out what an array was, so I managed to like virtually represent the deck of cards in an array of 52 elements. And instead of like writing loops to do all the things I needed to do with that array, I just wrote if-else statements. So I ended up writing like seriously 600 if-else statements to get this program to work. So
nice.
Yeah, it was just, I was terrible at it. And my teacher at the time, he was a nice fellow. I liked him a lot, but his response to like pretty much any question I had was like, figure it out for yourself. And I would learn a lot later on that there's things that I need to do specifically for me to learn code that are probably a little bit different from other people. But I did want to bring up one particular experience, which was quite interesting for me. In sort of like the last quarter of my second semester doing programming in high school, I had graduated to doing console-based C++ programs, and I couldn't understand classes. It didn't. I thought like class, like what I'm in right now, classroom. It just didn't make any sense to me, and I got pretty disillusioned at that point. But I do remember one particular experience which really jumped out at me and stuck with me as something where I thought maybe eventually I could do programming. So I had to write another card game. This time it was console blackjack in C++. And so I had figured out arrays, and I kind of had figured out how to use loops. I didn't understand how they kind of work. I didn't really think of it as like the computer's eyeball going sort of from line by line and then starting at the top line and then starting at the top line. I didn't really have a way to think about the loops, but I was kind of using them. And I was stuck on this one algorithm. I didn't know the word algorithm at the time, but I had to write an algorithm to shuffle this sort of virtual deck of cards, the 52 elements. So I remember just basically messing around for 2 weeks because it was such a difficult problem I couldn't really get started. So I pretty much just played StarCraft Brood War. And then finally, after about 2 weeks, I thought to myself, it's getting close to the end of the year here. I need to solve this problem. So I kind of one day just hunched over in my chair and just started thinking about this algorithm. And two things happened over the span of about 20 minutes, which, like I say, really stuck with me. So the first thing is that my mind was very disordered as a teenager. I was just constantly overanalyzing and imagining things and all up in my head. And part of that is just the way my brain works, and part of that was my upbringing. When I was focused in on that problem, for a brief period, my mind actually sort of contracted and became a little bit one-pointed, and all I was thinking about was this one particular problem. And that was a very peaceful experience. It was a bit of an experience of what I call stillness. We can talk about that stuff later, potentially. But basically, for the first moment in time, my mind kind of quieted down. Now I was still sort of thinking about the problem, but it was very peaceful. And then after about 20 minutes, the entire algorithm to shuffle the deck of cards, the 52 element array, popped into my head. And then I wrote it and it worked. And I felt good. For the first time, I felt like I was kind of a little bit surprised, but also pretty happy with myself. So the truth is that even though I had that little experience, I thought I sucked at programming. And to be honest, I was pretty terrible at it. Like, I had trouble learning to read as a kid. So I'm not good at like memorizing and learning things like the syntax and keywords of a language. I'm pretty good at it now just because most C-based languages are pretty similar. But for example, if you ask me to write a C++ for loop and I haven't done it in 6 weeks, or an enhanced for loop in Java, there's like a 80% chance I'm going to get it slightly wrong. So there's just things that I really wasn't good at and still I'm not great at. And after high school, I didn't have any plans to actually be a programmer because, like I say, I thought I sucked at it. And I kind of did, to be honest.
Okay, but you ended up as a programmer. So how did you flip this around? How did you end up really teaching everything properly yourself? Because from what I see with your articles and videos, you seem really experienced and you also know a lot of details and low-level stuff. So maybe if someone listening to this has problems with teaching themselves programming, can we extract any tips out of that for the general population? Are there any common mistakes that beginners make when they try to learn programming? What do you think about that?
There's a lot, And I think the first thing I would like to say, the most important thing is that um, I basically forgot everything I had learned from high school, and I didn't start programming again until 2013. And so I think the most important thing I can say is that it's very natural to spend like the first 2 years of your programming studies or career feeling lost at sea. I certainly did. Um, so the most important thing is that
C with C as SEA or C as the letter Z, as
that's
the
a great
programming
pun.
language.
I guess I was lost in C in high school, so C++. Good one there, monsieur. But yeah, it's very normal to just feel completely overwhelmed, basically, because whether you're studying computer science, which is this gigantic field which is full of mathematics, or if you're just learning Java, for example, there's so much to most programming languages, the ones that are actually used today, that it's very easy to feel overwhelmed. And in my case, I had no mentorship, so I had no idea how to actually build and design applications. So the truth is that for the first 2 years, the thing that allowed me to actually get over that hump is just that I never gave up. Part of that, a lot of that's my character and ego. I couldn't really accept defeat, but I just want to emphasize that for people. It's just so important. It's, as a beginner, unless you're really smart, and there's a few people out that. I do know a guy who was, in my opinion, a proper genius. He caught up to me where I was at an Android after 2 years in about 4 months, and then he shot way past me, and I've never caught up to him. There are people out there like that, but if you're someone like me, you're going to have to struggle through it. Now, I can offer a few things which might be useful to some people who feel like they're just really not having a good time learning the language. I had to really eventually figure out some tools and approaches that I use to this day to learn new things, whether it's a new language or a new sort of field of programming, like compiler development, for example. There are specific things that I use. So apart from just don't give up. The other thing is I always advocate for people to use a project-based learning approach. And the one really fortunate thing I can say in my career is that when I started doing Android apps myself in 2014, I accidentally started what I call a project-based learning approach. I'll explain what that is in a moment. And because of that, even though I was building really crappy applications initially, like they were terrible, I was practicing the skill of writing code, and most importantly, what a project-based learning approach does, which is where instead of trying to learn topics like a laundry list, like topic by topic by topic, and then trying to memorize it or writing stuff about it, you just write code. You pick an application, something you can deploy that you want to do. Hopefully it's something you're interested in. I picked a workout log, which is something that I was interested in. And you learn topics in order to build that particular project. This is going to do so many different things for your learning process. Number one, it's going to narrow your focus. You're going to learn topics in order to solve that particular problem. Number two, in my experience and opinion, you're going to learn the things you're going to memorize and understand the things that you learn to build that particular application much deeper. And most importantly, for me, I am terrible at learning and memorizing from jargon. I don't like jargon. I thought it was just me, but eventually my hero, so to speak, Richard Feynman, I found out he also hated jargon, so that made me feel a lot better. But I just don't really tend to remember technical definitions or understand them until I write the code. However, when it comes to memorizing things in code, memorizing the whole structure of an application and things like that, that's something I'm very good at. So really what I'm saying is I can't point to a particular person and say, this approach is going to work really well for you, because people are good at different things, and some people really are good at memorizing and thinking verbally. You need to explore what works for you, and you need to try a whole bunch of different things. I do think the project-based learning approach is something that's fairly universal. I think for most people, it's just a good way to focus your approach and to really cement the knowledge. So yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with the project-based learning. This is something I've found out for myself as well in the last 2 years, I think. If you know my first tutorials, or actually the tutorials I made for the first 2 years or so, they were really focused on isolated topics. And the stuff I made tutorials about was also the stuff I was learning. So basically everything I learned, I made a tutorial about. But because my viewers wanted to see and really liked these small tutorials, I kept making them and I kept learning in this way. And what happened is that I knew really a lot about very specific features and APIs. So I knew everything about notifications on Android, for example. But then suddenly 2 years later into my learning journey, I realized that I can't really build a real app. I have no clue how to build a real app. And this is when I noticed that I actually have to build something real to learn this properly. And I also noticed that it's much more fun to build a real app, and it keeps you much more motivated to build something that you can really use instead of learning like you learn for a topic in school where you just learn because it's on your list, basically. So I completely agree. And project-based learning, I think it has so many benefits. And also, at the moment, I'm building a little app that I also released to the Play Store, not because I expect that I make money from it, just because I want to have something real out that people can use. Because what I also notice is that this makes me focus on stuff that I would often ignore in other situations when I don't really have this skin in the game, when I don't really have something out. For example, when you have an app on the Play Store, you don't want it to break, right? So you have to write proper tests for it, or you should write proper tests for it. And this is something I have ignored for the most part before that, because if I make a tutorial for YouTube, I don't have to write tests at all, because most often people don't really care about that. So having a real app on the Play Store actually makes me put more focus on the stuff I avoided before. So I think it's a good approach. And yeah, I think it's useful to actually put something on the Play Store, even if it's not a great business idea, just to, you don't even have to add ads or any monetization strategy to it. Just put it out there so you have something that people can use. Use it as your learning tool, basically. Then also, I want to say that it's the same for me when it comes to struggling. People, because I have my YouTube channel and I basically present the final result, the refined code. People think that it comes very easy to me, but it doesn't at all. I find most of this stuff extremely difficult. And you talked a bit about having a mentor. You know Gabor Varadi, so hinten
I do. Epic Panda Force.
Yes. And I ask him a ton of questions, basically every day that I'm coding. And luckily, he kind of likes answering these programming questions. And I would be actually really lost without him. Or at least I would need much, much longer to learn the same stuff without him, because building a real app is really difficult if you want to do it properly. And having someone you can ask is very useful and can save you a lot of time. Now, it's not so easy to find people that you can ask that are not, because everyone has their own problems. Not everyone has time to answer your programming questions. But if people are struggling, then what they can try is they can look for a proper community where they can ask programming questions. For example, there is the Kotlin, for Kotlin, the programming language, there is a actual Slack channel where there are really knowledgeable, high quality programmers in this channel, and also people that work on the Android libraries themselves, like Ian Lake and all these guys from Google. They are there and they are answering questions. So this is a good place to start, because there you get really high quality answers. And I also have problems with programming jargon, which is more difficult for me because I am German. My native language is not English. So I also had problems and still have understanding terms, even like domain, for example. The term domain doesn't. I think I know by now what it means, kind of, but I could probably not explain it in a real sentence. But when I did not know what this word was or what this word meant at all in programming, then I tried to Google it, and then it was often explained like the domain layer is the layer where the domain logic is handled or something like that. So they explained it with the same words again, and I wasn't smarter after that. So it's really good when people can explain in normal English terms what something means, but it's very rare. Okay, and you already touched on this a little bit, that you worked in a little bit in construction, where you try to keep yourself above, where you try to pay your bills, right? While you were learning programming. And other jobs like dishwashing that people would not consider fun most of the time. And from your blog, I also read that you have some experience with bad mind states. You had phases of depression in this time when you were declined from university, right? So maybe you can talk about this a little bit. How do you cope with these bad mind states, and how do you avoid them?
So just to give a bit of context and introduction to that, sort of the depression and those sorts of things. So I grew up in an environment where the people who raised me didn't have adequate coping mechanisms to deal with their emotional problems, substance abuse, and just really unhealthy emotions, essentially. I actually moved out when I was 17, 2 months after high school, and I basically had to relearn these things for myself. So depression and sort of a lack of productivity as a result of that has been a recurring theme in my life. Now, fortunately, through YouTube primarily and the internet in general, I've been able to sort of absorb a lot of useful information from my various mentors and then apply it in my own life. So sort of the good news is that it's much less of a problem than it used to be. And I'm going to try and share a few things which hopefully people can use and apply, because ironically, this is actually something that I get asked about quite a lot in my live stream Q&As, because I think depression and motivation and productivity, these things are all kind of intertwined. So the first thing that I suggest, this is what I do for myself, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I can fix other people's problems. You'll see some people on YouTube that purport to do that. And to be honest, they're either lying to you or they're trying to sell you something, or they're self-deluded. But what I can share with you is the things that I've used over the span of about 7 years to try and deal with my own problems. And one thing that might make me a little bit uniquely useful in explaining this is that I'm a very, very obsessively minded person. So these are things that I think about every day. And pretty much my primary concern for almost the last decade has been, how do I get my work done when I want to do it? And a lot of that has come down to sort of cultivating healthier emotions. So this is a huge topic. So I've tried to sort of boil this down into three main things that this would be like if someone came to me on the Q&A or something like that, asking about depression or productivity, the things that I personally focus on. So the first thing that I suggest people look at is to ask yourself, is my depression, my bad emotional state, my lack of productivity, is it a mechanical problem, which is my way of saying, is it a physical problem? So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. We can later if we have time and if Florian wants to go into a little more detail on these things, but just really quickly, we're talking about like, what does your diet look like? What does your sleep look like? Do you exercise? Do you meditate or do yoga or do something to sort of calm your mind down? So obviously these sort of physical things and the mental things are intertwined. But one thing I would look for is if you feel really good on a certain day and then the next day you feel bad and it's kind of up and down like that, I would suggest either contacting your doctor and getting blood tests done to see if you have nutrient deficiencies, or just generally take a look at your diet and your lifestyle and try and evaluate it from there. So the second thing I suggest to look at, and there's a lot to that first point. I'm kind of covering it in 60 seconds, but Things you can apply sort of immediately. The first thing that I suggest you think about, or the second thing is, do you have some kind of goal? Obviously not a groundbreaking idea here, but let me give you a quick example. I actually applied for a job at the sort of the end of August. I didn't end up getting the job. And so prior to that job, I had this job I was preparing for about a number of months. And so it was very easy for me to motivate myself to do things like learning Russian and studying compiler development and stuff like that. So when you have some kind of goal, obviously it's easier to motivate yourself, especially if there's a deadline. Now, immediately after that, I had no particular goal and no particular deadline. And of course, my productivity started to dip. I probably would have gotten depressed years ago, but my life is a lot better right now and I have better coping mechanisms. But there was about a week where I wasn't really getting a lot of work done. I had stopped studying languages. I'd kind of stopped working on my compiler development. So what do you do? Sometimes life will sort of uproot your plans, or sometimes it'll give you opportunities, but sometimes having a specific goal isn't really possible. It's great when it's there, but this is one of the most important things that I've learned, and I've really tried to apply this in my life recently, and I think it's quite useful. So if you have a goal if you have a goal, great. Let's assume you've taken care of your health, you're a relatively healthy person. You're still not getting your work done. I think at that point, what people need to really think about is what I like to call structure, or for my computer science nerds out there, scheduling policy, which comes from CPU studies, but some kind of structure. So this could include, you're going to have to play around with this. I've played around with these things for years, so I know what kind of works for me, but having like a daily to-do list might be something. Having a rough schedule, having a highly specific schedule where you pencil in almost every minute of your time, having some kind of structure in your life. This is incredibly important because if you're able to follow that structure, that's actually going to give you good emotions, and you have to actually consciously sort of encourage yourself to have these good emotions. So my experience has been having a structure can become your goal in absence of like a bigger goal. And that's how lately, for the past several years, I've been able to be just a lot more productive, even when I'm either feeling pretty lost or kind of feeling down, or just life's throwing a bunch of crap at me. Now, there's one very, very important thing you need to do regarding this structure. Two things, actually. So, for starters, and this ties back into what I was talking about with it being a mechanical problem. Over the span of days, weeks, months, etc., you need to think about everything you did yesterday or the day before or a week before, which made you feel bad today, which made you lethargic, so low energy, which messed up your mental focus, or just gave you brain fog, these sorts of things. You also need to consider things that you did yesterday or the day before or this morning or whatever that contribute to having a clear mind, lots of energy physically, lots of focus. And you need to really perform that analysis. So when you're creating your structure, you really need to factor those things into account. Now, the second really important thing to do, and this is a tough one for people who used to be really productive. I've had periods of my life where I was working 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, pretty much with no days off. When you've had the experience of being super productive, you can really kind of overshoot this and set your expectations way too high after a depression or after life kicks you in the nuts, basically. So what you need to do in this particular case is, with your structure, start very, very simply. Start with an hour a day. Start with a half hour a day, depending on what you're doing. And like I said before, even if it almost seems ridiculous to do so, if you get your hour of coding done per day, you have to give yourself positive feedback. You can't say to yourself, I could have done a lot more. You have to say, I did this. So start slow with something that you could do, maybe not on your worst day, but on a bad day. And just do that for a week, for like 5 days. And then after a certain number of days, you can bump things up. If on a given day you feel like doing more, that's fine. Just don't get into that thing where like, okay, my original goal was 1 hour. Today I killed it. I did 5 hours. I'm going to do 5 hours tomorrow, because then you're probably going to set yourself up for failure and then get depressed. So sometimes with certain things, I'll deliberately just do the hour and I won't go overhead and just make myself comfortable with that particular thing. So just to review really quickly, the 3 things that I really think about when it comes to productivity and depression, these sorts of things. So number 1, getting your health in order. Eat your vegetables. I feel like your mom or something, but just if you're feeling crappy, there's a pretty high chance that you have something wrong in your lifestyle, your diet, or something like that. Because my baseline mental sort of chemistry is pretty negative, I have to work out most days of the week. I have to eat healthy. I have to meditate. These things are not optional for me, and hopefully that's not the case with you, but it might be. Having a goal is great. Obviously, sometimes you just don't have anything obvious. If you don't have a goal, I actually suggest you not to worry about it too much. Just actually be patient, because sometimes life will ruin your plans and sometimes it will give you something better than what your plan already was. So just be patient. And in absence of a goal, you have to give yourself some kind of structure. That's what works for me.
So diet, exercise, sleep, those are all things that many people just ignore. They know that they should do it, but they often still ignore it because maybe they're too lazy, or they don't want to go through the work of getting rid of bad habits. But yeah, it can't be emphasized enough how important it is to exercise regularly, to eat properly, and to sleep enough to avoid stuff like depression and be more motivated in general. Now, I know that there are certain kinds of depression that are really illnesses that you can't simply avoid by doing exercise. But for many people, they will feel a lot better if they just build good habits. So this is something people should not avoid.
It's also, just really quickly, it's worth mentioning, I do know people who sleep like 4 hours a day and eat nothing but processed carbs, and they're geniuses. Don't compare yourself to those people, but they are out there, I admit it.
Yeah, for some people that works, but for 99.999%, it probably doesn't work like this.
Not for me.
Yeah, for me neither. And you quickly, or you touched on the topic, or you touched on the idea of having a schedule, which is interesting because I've also been on a schedule that I imposed on myself for the last 2 weeks. And it works wonders for me in terms of having a proper structure in my day and being motivated to do my stuff and do my work. And I've tried this before, and then sometimes I stopped using it. But when I have a real schedule, then I'm always much more productive. And I'm also much more happier because, and this is especially important for someone who is self-employed, who is responsible for his whole day, because I don't have anyone who looks at me 8 hours of the day and makes sure that I'm actually working. So I'm responsible for structuring my whole day, and I'm much more satisfied and happy when I have a schedule, because not only because I get more done, but also because I have fixed times where I take breaks. And then I can take these breaks without feeling guilty for not working right now. When I don't have a schedule, this often happens. Then I take a break and then I immediately feel guilty. Or maybe I should be working right now. Maybe the break is too long. But when I have but it's a bit dependent on your personal preferences and on your genetics, I think, because I know that a schedule doesn't work for everyone. For me, it works. If my calendar says 8 a.m. you start working, then I actually start working. Then I really have this motivation to start working at this time, and then I take the break when it's time for a break. So there's something in my head that really likes the structure, and I really have an easy time following it, but I know that it's not for everyone. But also what I like about a schedule is that you start focusing on putting in the time and the work instead of always looking at the end goal. Because if you always look at the end goal, then every obstacle along the way discourages you. Every time you have a problem that you don't understand something or that something doesn't work can be really frustrating and demotivating if you just focus on the end goal, like becoming job ready as a programmer, for example. Then every time you don't understand something, it's frustration basically. But if you have something like a schedule or a time-based approach where you focus or where you just try to put in the hours, quality hours of learning time, then these little blocks of time become your intermediate goal. This is what you focus on. On any given day, I just focus on following the schedule as good as possible and making sure that it's quality time that I put in there. And this way, it's just easier for me to stay motivated because I have a feeling of satisfaction whenever I finished something in my schedule, whenever I finished a time block. I hope this makes sense, but it definitely works for me.
I'd love to actually riff on that for a second. I think that's a really wonderful point. And I saw a tweet you had made about debugging, if I recall correctly. And it was debugging an issue which wasn't like a coding error. It was just some ridiculous. Remind me what the issue was.
I had no special example, but what I was basically saying is that especially beginners, they often say, oh, I had this bug and I try to figure it out. And I needed 2 hours to fix this bug. And then they say, those were 2 hours wasted. But this is not wasted time. You learned something.
Yeah, exactly. That's so important. And what you said about, like, the way I think about it, when you have that schedule, a really important thing to do, as you said, is putting the time in, not solving the problem, is your reward. And that can be a weird little mental shift for people who grow up with a lot of guilt, like most Westerners, apparently. But that is such an important mental shift. Like, it's not that I'm not. So let's say, for example, it takes you 2 weeks to solve a problem. Then probably, Florian, you've had the same experience of getting stuck on one single problem for 2 weeks, is probably in the beginning of your career. For me, the longest I ever had was one problem for 3 weeks. It's very easy to get demoralized and to basically be unhappy for those 3 weeks. And then finally you solve the problem, or maybe you gave up, but finally you solve the problem and then you get to feel good. No, that's not how it should work. If you put the time in, then based on your structure, then you say to yourself, I feel good. I put the effort in. That way, even if it takes you 3 weeks, every day you feel good because you put the time in. So that's such a great point.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I feel. And I also like the schedule because it simply shows me where my time goes. And at the end of the day, I have a feeling for exactly how much I've done, how much rest I've taken. And as you already said, the point is not to overshoot all the time and try to do as much as possible and cram as much work in. You can start small and you don't have to put a ton of work into your schedule. It's just about focusing on what you put in on any given day and not so much on the final result, because this never ends. There's always something new to learn. There are always new problems that are coming up. And if this is always just an obstacle, then you will be endlessly unhappy in your whole career, because there is no moment when you say, okay, now I have learned everything and I have solved the last problem and now I can be happier. This is the same in work and in life, basically. So you need to find a way to focus more on the moment or on any given day in itself. Yeah, and when I've followed my schedule for a day, then I feel very satisfied.
Yeah, sometimes for me, I'll still have that guilt creep in, and then I can be like, nope, I followed the schedule. I'm good. Those negative habits pop into your mind, and so.
Yeah, this is thoughts like this are also why meditation is important. I've noted this down for later, but if there's time, we should talk about meditation a bit more at a later point, because I know that 99% of the people watching this don't care at all about meditation. So I don't want to bore them. I
Of
rather
course,
put it rather put it more towards the end.
Yep.
Okay, one more thing I want to mention is that if someone talked you into learning programming, or if you did it for the money, then you should, and you just hate it, then you should consider doing something else. Because today it's very easy to switch careers and do something else and teach you something else. So if there are people watching this that really never enjoy programming at all, and for which it always feels like a chore, then they should switch careers as early as possible. And I also started learning to code at 27, so really late. Or it's actually not even that late yet. I would still, now at 31, I would still switch careers if I noticed that I hated programming. Because you actually don't need that long to become somewhat sufficient in a topic if you enjoy it. Because if you enjoy it, then it turns into play for you, and then you just naturally learn better and faster and are more motivated. But yeah, even I think programming is the closest to a passion what I can find in my life. I think it's naturally interesting to me, but I still don't find it easy, and I still don't find it easy to stay motivated every day. So that's
Yeah.
completely normal. One more thing that people on Twitter have wondered about: you live in a real rural area, right? Or don't you live there anymore? I always thought you live in the forest.
Yeah, in a wooden box.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a bit of a long story. So I grew up on a tiny island. Like literally there was, when I was born, about 1,800 people on it. You could walk across the island sort of widthwise in probably about an hour, although lengthwise it was pretty long. It's this beautiful rural forested area with some mountains in the BC coast, so the west coast of Canada, where I'm from. So I had moved there sort of at the start of the pandemic. I think that was like, I want to say like March 2020. And I was there for over a year. And so I remember someone, I think Don Felker actually had asked about what the benefits of that are. So the great thing about living in sort of the middle of nowhere is that, let's say, for example, I sit at my computer for like 4 hours and I need to get up and go and take a walk. I can get up and go and take a walk in this beautiful nature. Like there was literally 80 acres of nature in a beautiful climate to walk around in. I grew up in that forest. Wandering around there was basically what I spent half my childhood doing. The other half was probably playing Elder Scrolls games. So it's a place where I can go into and I feel at home and just feel very calm. So if you have the opportunity to live in a rural area, particularly one with a good climate, I think that's a really important thing. I think it's a wonderful thing, especially if you like nature. And so the story is, so the place is still there and I can go back, relatively speaking, anytime I want. Basically what happened is I met a girl who was worth moving to Alberta for. She unfortunately, so she's a medical resident, a doctor, but sort of when you become a doctor in Canada right after med school, you still have residency. So you have to do that for like usually 2 to 5 years, depending on your program. She actually tried to relocate to BC, where I was, but unfortunately she wasn't able to do that. So I had basically the choice of staying in my rural area, which I had internet and stuff like that, but I wasn't exactly like living in luxury. It's rural living. Also, the power kept going out and stuff like that. These are the things you deal with in a rural area. I had that choice, or I could move to basically a city, get an apartment, and live with her. And she has totally been worth it. So hopefully we'll still end up there eventually, because I'm used to city living. I've lived in a city. I lived in cities since I was 17, but my heart really is in the on the fields and in the forests. And so that's basically, in a perfect world, we would be still living out there. But here I am in downtown Calgary, a nice part of it, so I have nothing to complain about.
Yeah, I don't know if you've already said this, but does it help with your mental state to live there? I mean, I can read between the lines that it does.
Absolutely, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. Part of it is being surrounded by nature. Uh, assume assuming you're similar to me, is very peaceful. It's just beautiful surroundings. I think part of it honestly has to do with maybe like there's more oxygen in the air when you're just surrounded by trees and foliage. There's something about taking a 20-minute walk in a forest that just calms you right down, has been my experience. Maybe it's also a bit of a psychological thing from my childhood. That was my happy place. But yeah, it did wonders for my mental state. And on a certain level, you're going to experience, it's going to be boring. It's going to be slow paced. But the benefit is if you can still have a good mindset, it's going to be a very peaceful existence, which is, if you can calm your mind down enough, that's honestly priceless.
Yeah, I also grew up in a more rural area, and I actually grew up. Our house was right on the forest, basically. So behind our house there was only a forest, and the city had like 3,000 people, I think. But as a kid, I hated it. I didn't like it at all. I didn't like playing in the forest. But now I would actually love. Or this is the thing for the last. So before I moved to this city here, Erfurt, which is a larger city in Germany, I lived in Austria for 4 years. No, 3 years actually, and it was also a really rural area with very few people, and it has benefits and downsides. Of course, the nature and everything is great, but I actually like having more people around in the city. I think it depends on everyone's personal preferences. Some people prefer living in a city, some people prefer living at the forest. It has downsides and benefits for me. Unfortunately, it was not very quiet where I lived, even though it was a very rural place. I had a bakery next to my apartment, and my neighbor was always building something on his house. So maybe this is why I didn't really enjoy it, because it was loud. There weren't many people, but it was still loud as hell.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, if I may, a funny thing about that. So I expected to move out there and be in just this pristine, quiet wilderness with like some farm animals you can hear in the distance. But it actually turned out that where I lived is like one of the main, I could get this wrong, I think they're called turning points or something for aircraft flying from Vancouver to Victoria. So although on a certain level it was quiet, on a bad day, like every 20 to 30 minutes, there would be a plane flying overhead. And when I was recording my last video course, I would literally, recording took like 4 times extra time because I'd be explaining something and then the plane would fly overhead right in the middle of a cut, and it was really annoying. So it's a different set of problems, rural living.
yeah, I had to do exactly the same when I recorded my tutorials in Austria. I also had to record everything a couple of times because there was always a noise in between. And we also had power outages regularly. But this is why I bought one of these backup units, and they actually work pretty well. So if there's a power outage, then you get like 20 minutes of still electricity. And it's enough to keep your PC alive. And I'm still using it to this day, because why not? It's always nice to... I mean, where I live, there was no power outage yet in the last 2 years, but it can always happen. And it always sucks if your PC just shuts off in the middle of you doing something.
Yeah. Yeah, and when the power kicks on again, it can actually fry your stuff. But since you have the UPS,
really?
then that would protect it.
Yeah, it's really useful to have. Okay, let's get away a bit from the mental health stuff. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, why did you decide to teach on YouTube. So you have your YouTube channel, which of course I will put a link to into the description or into the show notes. And you're very consistent with these videos. You have been doing this for a few years now, and you consistently keep putting out new content. What's the benefit for you of teaching this? Because I know that ad revenue is not is not the motivation of that. It's really low, especially for oddly, the ad revenue for Android is the lowest of all programming topics, I think. I compared this with other YouTubers on this one Discord chat, and they all have at least twice the ad revenue per 1,000 views than we Android guys. So Android is a really unprofitable niche. But why do you still teach on YouTube? And if you want to say it, what do you actually do for a living? So what is paying your bills at the moment?
Yeah, for sure. So it actually goes back pretty far. So in grade 11, in my high school, we just funny little anecdote. I had to take a water taxi to high school. So I literally would ride a boat for 45 minutes at the start of the day and then back.
Sounds amazing.
Island living. It meant I had to get up extra early and get home extra late, but it had some benefits. Anyways, in grade 11, we had this course you could take, which was called peer tutoring. So basically, you would show up in like a lower grades class for usually a semester, and you would almost be like a teacher's aide. A lot of times the teachers, they kind of just let you like do whatever you want. It was sort of like almost like a study block depending on the teacher you'd get. I had this one teacher, I'll even say his name, Bruce Smith was his name. He's not teaching anymore. He was originally a music teacher, but he ended up teaching mathematics grade 9 class. And if you're familiar with the education system for math in Canada, it's terrible. Like grade 9 math is like probably what people learn in grade 3 in Germany or something. You think I'm joking, but we were doing like polynomial expressions, introduction to that in grade 9. So anyways, this particular teacher, not only did he have a vicious wit, like you did not want to say anything to him, but he did something very special. I guess he saw that I liked teaching people or something. I don't really know. But he made me teach a class. I still remember the lesson I gave. It was in factoring polynomial expressions. And I was pretty nervous doing it. And, well, I had huge nerves before doing it. And luckily, one of the kids from my island, 2 of them actually in this class were from my island. So I was able to start by kind of ripping on these 2 kids and making fun of them. And that got me comfortable. And then I was able to teach the rest of the class. But that really stuck with me because even though I'm what I would call an extreme introvert, for some weird reason, I've always been good at public speaking, and I think I gave a pretty decent lesson. I created a little lesson plan and went through it in a supportive environment, because he said to me before, if you mess up, I'll catch you, don't worry, kind of thing. So I had that early experience of enjoying teaching people. The next thing is that for a while I played StarCraft Brood War. Not really competitively. I tried to be competitive, but if you've ever played that video game, there are people that are so good at that. Like literally, there are some people in Korea who used to get paid like over $100,000 US to play that game. So I was pretty bad at it, but I made a couple tutorial videos because there are some like little things that I thought I could explain to people. I still have those videos on one of my YouTube channels, but they're hidden. But I actually enjoyed like recording and explaining things, and people actually gave me positive feedback. Moving forward to 2016, so I'd been doing Android for 2 years, and basically I remember around like late 2015, the recycler view was introduced, if I recall correctly. I think it was introduced around then. And I remember reading the documentation for it, and it didn't make any sense. And then I watched a video from someone who I won't mention, but if you were around that time, it was basically the most popular Android teacher.
Slide Node.
Yeah.
What's a Slide Node?
It was Slide Node, okay. Yeah. So Viv's from Slide Nerd. So I remember watching that video. No disrespect to Viv's, but basically he had some graphic assets in there, but he basically just used the names of the classes and really vaguely explained what was going on. And you need a linear layout manager and you need this and this. Didn't explain what any of those things really were, if I recall correctly. And I don't mean any disrespect to him.
This is why I didn't want to mention the name. Okay, now I've called him out.
Yeah, but it's he's doing fine, I'm sure. So anyways, I watched his video and it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And in looking at the documentation and in watching his video like 30 times, over the span of about a month, I managed to get a recycler view working. At the end of like that month, I thought to myself, this is not actually that complicated. Like if someone had just clearly explained to me what to do and what each thing is, I could have actually probably wired this together in a day or two. So I thought to myself, well, at the time, like Slidner and I think the new Boston, I'm not even sure if he was doing any videos, but at the time it was basically just Slidner making these videos. So at the time I thought to myself, I think I could, put together a tutorial, which would be useful for people. And it might sort of help my own knowledge to cement it, because I already knew at the time, if you want to understand something clearly, then preparing a lesson and teaching it is a great way to do that. So that's basically what spawned my first tutorial series, which was on the recycler view way back in 2016. Those videos were just terrible. I'm sure like you look back on your first videos and because I wasn't a great programmer at the time. Even though I'd been doing Android for 2 years, that whole 2 years I'd been working full time. So it's not like I was doing Android full time. So I did those tutorials and I already knew to expect negative feedback and to not take it personally. But something really weird happened. The feedback I got and the like ratio was almost entirely positive, which I really didn't expect. So this created this feedback loop where initially I really wanted that validation. That sort of thing of wanting the likes and using that as your sort of self-esteem thing, which is really unhealthy for any creators listening to this. You need to eventually get rid of that idea of basing your happiness on how many likes and views you get. But at the time, that was a factor. And then, just as you did, I would make videos about the things that I was learning. So that would force me to learn and understand these things better and to sort of document my learning. Eventually, I wanted to do the live content because I thought I don't have any mentors around me and I didn't really know how to learn from source code. So I thought to myself, if I do this stuff live, I'll know how good I am because people will tell me immediately. And maybe if some of the stuff is useful, then it might also be useful for other people. This had this sort of crazy effect where eventually a number of people started sort of watching them regularly. They told me to build a Slack channel, which I did. So we've got like over 300 members now. And it created this community of many people who are more talented than me in terms of programming. And by the end of it, here we are. I've met so many wonderful people who are, dear friends to me. I've learned from so many people at this stage. I've been able to just share ideas with people. So it's all sort of culminated in probably the best thing I've ever done is really making the YouTube channel. And it's just why I continue to do it, is all those things I just mentioned there. Like you mentioned, I don't do it for the money. YouTube revenue is not what it used to be. And I remember being really disappointed. Like you and I were probably on the tail or just when YouTube revenue started to really suck. Because I remember watching people in like 2014 who had like 20,000 subscribers and they were like making a reasonable living, and doesn't work that way now.
Yeah, I have 185 or 86,000 now, and YouTube ad revenue makes me like 700 euros per month. That's not small, but it's nothing you can live off.
Yeah, for sure.
And okay, you don't do it for the ad revenue, but you also have courses, right, on Skillshare and Udemy, is that correct? And of course, we can put links to them into the show notes later.
Yeah, so I'm going to say some bad things about Skillshare. They abruptly canceled closed my account a month or two ago and accused me of all this stuff. Like, they accused me of having my account similar to other hacked accounts. They accused me of lying about the reviews and views. They accused me of being associated with botnets, like 6 different things which were completely fabricated. And the irony is, I thought to myself, if I was actually doing all of these things, then the views and the revenue on my videos would have been a lot higher than they were. So unfortunately, I'm no longer on Skillshare. So I do have like 2 courses on Udemy. At the moment, all of my courses are available free on my channel. So if you want to learn more from me, then you can hop over to my YouTube channel. So I basically, at the moment, am sort of low-key job hunting. Basically did a little bit of contracting work, and my expenses were super low in my previous apartment. So I'm basically living off of the revenue I make from YouTube, the money I did make from my courses, and then savings at the moment. Luckily, I'm living pretty comfortably for now, but yeah.
Yeah, it's similar for me. I also don't make a lot of money actually, and I have very low costs of living. But it has changed a little bit now because I made this one course with Swinton that's bringing in some money, and I actually now started doing some sponsorships for videos where I give a shout out to a company, but I only do that if I really like the product. And so ad revenue is not a lot, but I also want to say that you can make a lot of money if you have some kind of brand that you build, and if you have a reasonable following, reasonable numbers of followers or subscribers. So it's not like this is completely useless. You can make a lot of money from this. It's just not as easy as people imagine, I think.
Yeah, that's a really important point, is that you want to almost think of it like if you're doing a YouTube channel or building a social media platform. And in fairness, Florian is way better than I am at doing that. But you want to almost think of those eyeballs that you're attracting, the views, the subscribers, as money. Because eventually, if you do a good job and you get a larger following, when you launch a product, and hopefully it's a good quality product, then you're going to have initial sales boosted, and then you can potentially get higher rankings depending on what you're doing. So business-wise, it is a very good idea. And that was actually some consideration for me in doing the YouTube channels as well.
Yeah, for example, when I built this small app that I put on the Play Store, I immediately had a few hundred downloads on the first day, basically, just because I have a following. I'm not making any money from this. I just want to say that it's really useful to have a community. And teaching on YouTube or creating programming tutorials in general also helps with learning, because teaching is a great way to learn, because you really realize where you have knowledge gaps. This is something I've already said a few times, just want to repeat it here. Okay, so you are low-key job hunting at the moment, so you don't have a really great source for these contract jobs, because it's what I was asking for, your secret source to get great contract. Is it called contract jobs or contracting jobs? I guess it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter too much for me. Really, my source has just been through the people I've met, the people who sort of know me through the channel and the Slack stuff. That's sort of where I've got the contracts that I've been working on. I don't do a lot of contracting, though. It's definitely not my main expertise.
Yeah, the few jobs I've done so far, I also got through my YouTube channel. So this is another benefit of building your brand. People will notice you and they will find you if they like your stuff. I also had people that wanted specifically me to build their app. And I said, I don't have time for it at the moment, but I can refer you to someone else. But they said, no, I'd rather wait and I'd rather have you build it. And this is really what you get from building a brand. But what are your future goals? Because if I read it correctly on your blog, you want to eventually be completely self-employed. Is this correct? And you want to have your own apps too?
Yeah, it's my goals have changed a little bit over the years. So the truth is that my favorite 2 things to do really are learning and teaching. And it's very difficult to be a product owner at the same time. So I will be working on an application shortly. It's actually a remake of the first application I built, which I do intend to be a product that I release. But for the most part, long term, like we're talking 5 or 10 years into the future, I don't plan to focus primarily on product development. My longer term goals, so for one, is I would like to understand computing and programming and computer science at every level. So this includes, cryptocurrency. I've covered digital circuits. I've covered operating systems. At the moment, I'm working on language development. I feel very comfortable with high-level programming in several languages. I'm pretty decent with the JVM, stuff like that. Machine learning is something I haven't looked into, but that's definitely on my list. And then eventually quantum computing when I have a lot more spare time on my hands. So a lot of my goals these days are largely academic, with the eventual hope that I can basically make a full-time living almost exclusively teaching. But with that being said, I don't want to be someone who just teaches. I also want to be spending, preferably half my time writing code, whether it's writing machine learning code or whatever. I don't really care. I don't have to spend the rest of my life writing GUI mobile applications. Not that they'll exist in 20 years' time the way they do. But I really just want to cover all these different topics and just continue to share knowledge on things that I feel comfortable sharing my knowledge. So things where I've implemented significant projects in. And if I could sort of wave a magic wand, that's what I would be doing, say, 5 years from now.
Yeah, you said that you don't want to be one of those guys who just teaches and doesn't really build anything real, right? And I agree with that, because then it can easily happen that you lose track of what really matters in the industry if you just teach. So as you said, it's difficult to have both in a real app or a real software product, but also create tutorials at the same time. So one strategy to approach this is to basically teach what you learned from making this product. So this way you can combine it a little bit. For example, the small app I have on the Play Store is a source for me for learning new stuff. And then I can create tutorials about these topics. So this way you can combine it a little bit. But it's still difficult also because there is so much to manage besides programming when you have a real product. Even if you just have an app on the Play Store, you always have to keep track with these changes that they want from you to keep your app on the store, changes in certain restrictions they suddenly set when the SDK number changes, or updates in how they handle taxes or writing a privacy policy. All the small stuff that doesn't really have to do with programming. You have to take care of this as well. So this makes it not so easy.
I think also, and I'd love to hear your experience with this, I think a lot of people, they watch our YouTube videos, probably most of them watch your videos. They watch YouTube videos and they think, oh, it must have taken like a couple of days to make that video. And it's like, a lot of people, unless they've actually had the experience of trying to create high quality educational content, don't understand that, like, the last course I made, I built one application with 2 screens. It was a Sudoku application using Jetpack Compose, and it had some fancy graph data structure algorithms to basically dynamically generate the Sudoku puzzles. That tutorial, which is like, I think 3.5 hours long, took me 200 hours to make. Like about 2 months of 8-hour days constantly. And while I was doing that, I wasn't really able to write significant application code anywhere else. So I think a lot of people don't actually understand how difficult it is to be a content creator and to keep writing significant application code. And I think that's a great idea. What you said there is trying to combine those two as much as possible.
Yeah, making tutorials is really difficult. The one course I made with Swinton, with Gabor, we also needed around 2 months, I think. And it was really painful process for me. Yeah. I spent many days where I had to stay awake till 4 a.m. in the morning because I needed to talk to Google employees on Twitter, direct messages, and they live in the US and in a different time zone. So I had to wait because I really needed answers to specific questions I had. And this was the only way for me to get to them and to really get them to respond to me. Which, by the way, is really cool because I had people like Jetpack, you know
Oh,
this guy. He actually responded to me in direct messages on Twitter, and he also answered my questions, which I think was great. So Jetpack is one of the Google employees that works on these Jetpack libraries. And he was not the only one. Also, Dustin Lamb, he worked on paging 3, I think. He also answered my questions, which was amazing. But it was also really, it was really hard work to create such a course if you want to do it properly. Especially when you do it with Jetpack libraries, because they're always in alpha and they always have bugs that are really hard to work around. And I personally have to say, even though I have this big YouTube channel, teaching is not the thing I really enjoy so much. I actually enjoy coding more than creating content about coding, which is a bit of a problem right now, and which is also the reason why I try stuff like creating this podcast to get a bit of variation, because I'm just bored of making tutorials over and over again. I still want to do tutorials, but I also need to try some different stuff. Yeah, my dream always was to eventually have my own app or my own software startup. I'm sure if this really was the case, it would not be as great and as amazing and as fun as I imagine it. It would also be very difficult. But this is always what I have in mind, or what my dream is, to have my own software startup where I work on and have a product that people really use, and basically be coding most of the time. I'm trying out a few ideas and then I will see where it brings me. I'm patient in this regard. But the thing is, I know that I could make a ton of money if I would just focus on courses 100%. Because I already have everything in place to sell these courses. I have the following, I've built my reputation with these tutorials. I could make a ton of money with courses, but it's really a painful process, and I'm a bit burnt out from making tutorials, to be honest. So yeah, even though it makes me less money, I want to try out some other things at the moment.
Well, can I riff on that for 1 second?
Sure.
This is just, and I understand. I was, as far as Canadian standards are poor. Like I lived under the poverty line in Canada for I think the first 5 or 6 years that I left home. If you come from like sort of that background, or maybe otherwise, you can tend to think that happiness and fulfillment will come from having a fat bank account. And I just want to emphasize to everyone listening, like, I live very comfortably these days. I used to live pretty rough, like using paper towel as a filter for my black coffee. I used to live pretty rough. Nowadays, I'm comfortable, but I'm definitely not rich. But I am so happy, so content. So I think for people listening, it's probably worth chasing the dollar a couple times just to understand how unhappy that can make you. But just understand that happiness really doesn't come from having a fat bank account. I'm not saying you shouldn't try and make a good living. Not what I'm saying at all. But I suggest for people, just as Florian is doing, one of the few things I've done correctly is I've always put my personal interests as goal number one. A couple times I've put money as number one, and I always left those experiences feeling very unhappy. So I think it's really important for people to understand just that follow what interests you, because you're going to be more motivated. And I think long term, it's going to make you a lot happier than doing things explicitly to get that money and make it rain.
Yeah. I've stopped believing in putting money first a long time ago. It also doesn't really make sense to me. I mean, you use money to buy stuff, and it's great to buy stuff, but it's completely understandable that this doesn't equate necessarily to happiness. So my priority is always to put happiness first, wake up in the morning and be motivated for the day, which is again not always the case, but this is my main goal. And money is really somewhere behind that, as far as it when it comes to goals, to life goals. What I've also noticed in your tutorials is that you put a lot of focus on the more low-level stuff. I think you are building your own programming language, and I think you also worked on a compiler. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
And what's your motivation for that?
So there's a number of reasons. So the first thing is that I'm a nerd. I want to understand things that I'm interested in at a very deep level. And one of the things that will happen to you, especially if you're a self-taught developer and you're starting in a high-level language like JavaScript or Java or any JVM language really, is that you might be really good at building applications, which is, a very profitable skill and nothing to laugh at. But you're probably not going to understand things at a lower level. And this was a huge contributor of kind of like an imposter syndrome for me doing my videos. I hated it that I didn't understand these lower level concepts. And then it was also just, I would meet people who had degrees who couldn't build an application to save their life. Like the worst I ever met, nice fellow, but he had a master's in computer science and he didn't have a GitHub account or any kind of revision control. He'd never written any executable code and deployed it to a platform or deployed it to revision control or anything like that. And he was actually wondering why he couldn't get work. So meeting those people, I thought to myself, well, the one thing they really have over me, assuming they paid attention in classes, is this knowledge of these lower level concepts. And then finally, I thought to myself, there's probably things here that would make me a much better app developer. Like a great example would be the concepts in software engineering, which is a topic that I avoided like the plague for like my first 4, maybe even 6 years as a software developer. Because I thought it was very math heavy and stuff like that. And I just hated math. I was good at some kinds of math like calculus, but arithmetic I still suck at. So it was a number of different things, wanting to understand these things, wanting to be a better teacher. And then I think what really kind of clicked is that the first time I really dove into one of these topics was software architecture. And a funny thing happened, which has been happening my entire career as a programmer, which is that when I finally got over my fear of the topic and put the time in and sifted through a bunch of really awful resources, because that's what scares a lot of people away from these topics, is there's just not very many good teachers. There's more good teachers for software engineering now, but some of the lower level topics like digital circuits and stuff, there's still not a lot of good resources. Once I got over that fear and actually got into these things, I was able to realize that in many cases, they were a lot easier to understand than I thought. For some people who are listening, this might be a little bit useful. It might be useful for me to share some of the things I did to learn these topics. Let's take digital circuits, for example. I'm not going to go into technical details about metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors. I'm not going to talk about that crap. What I did to learn how digital circuits work, which is basically how a computer works at the lowest level. We're not even talking really programming language or zeros and ones. Zeros and ones is an abstraction on top of digital circuits. What I did to learn this is I built a computer in Minecraft. It took 3 weeks to do it. But in doing that, I now feel absolutely comfortable with my understanding of how a computer works at a low level. And I did take an MIT course and I forget most of it and I didn't understand any of it because it was just jargon. But now I actually understand how computers work at a low level in a way that's very easy for me to think in sort of 3D. A level up from that, someone might want to look into operating systems. So what I suggest, and shout out to my friend Jamie Corkill for suggesting this book to me, Operating Systems, 3 Easy Pieces, is a great way to learn how computers work at the operating system level. It's a free book that you can find. Now, with that being said, if you're a beginner, don't do that. It's after a couple of years, if you're comfortable in Java, quite good with it, you might want to look into that. If you're an absolute beginner, it's pretty technical C code, but it just does a good job of explaining how these sorts of things, like how does a CPU work, how does virtual memory work, that kind of stuff. My current learning project is compiler development. So for those people who don't really understand what a compiler is, in very simple terms, it is a program. It's a program that you feed source code into. So for example, it could be a Kotlin code. You feed it into the Kotlin compiler, that thing will translate that code. It'll translate it into some intermediate language, usually what they call IR, intermediate representation. But it'll translate it into like JVM bytecode, or it'll translate it into machine code if it's targeting native or whatever. So basically what I thought is I wanted to learn how we get from like Java to executable code. I wanted to learn how that compiler process works because it was just a personal goal of mine. So the first thing I thought to myself is I'm going to do what I always do, which is I'm going to build a project that I can run that is a compiler. So, and then in learning about compiler development, you could write a compiler for a different language and it can work. I could write my own Kotlin compiler. But then I thought to myself, why don't I try creating my own language as well? So that was on a certain level kind of a mistake because that took a lot longer to sort of do, like to actually design a language. It's a very simple language. It's called Donk, which is short for donkey. Big surprise. So I have the basic sort of specification for the language set up. It actually looks quite a bit like Kotlin. Not sure why. Might be my favorite programming language. And then I have the sort of the first two stages of the whole compilation process done, which is like a tokenizer, also known as a scanner, also known as a lexer, people with their stupid jargon words. And then I have a parser built. I kind of just completed that. And then I need to write the compiler thing, which will take that crap and then make it into something that can be run on, say, WebAssembly. So yeah, that's my current sort of learning goal. And probably after I sort of figure out compiler development, then I'll probably get into machine learning.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that ones and zeros are already an abstraction, because I've always thought the same. When I hear people talk about abstraction, they usually say the computer only understands zeros and ones, but that's not quite correct. Zeros and ones are already an abstraction. So what the computer understands is basically on and off, or is it correct? Electricity or no electricity?
That is exactly right. And I really didn't understand what bits were until I built this computer in Minecraft and realized that, let's say we're talking about a 64-bit computer. I want you to imagine, hopefully someone has played Minecraft when I explain this. Imagine you have like redstone lines, 64 lined up in a row. And then if one is on, so has the electrical charge, then that would indicate the abstraction of that is a binary digit, like a 1 or a 0. So you're exactly right. 0 and 1 is a mathematical abstraction over top of wires that are on or off. It doesn't have to be wires, but for the purposes of modern computers, it's probably going to be a tiny little wire.
Yeah, Minecraft sounds like a fun way to learn the basics of this. I've seen on YouTube some people building these redstone computers, and it seems like a nice way to have, or a fun way to learn this stuff.
Yeah,
so maybe I should try this as well.
I do suggest it. The tutorial I watched was by this YouTuber named, I think, Redstone Without Limits. Some parts of his tutorial was hard to follow because he would make a few off-camera changes. But about 3 weeks of strong effort is what it took me, and by the end of it, it was totally worth it. It was really cool to be like, hey, I literally built a computer.
Yeah, this would actually be a nice idea for a live stream. Have you considered that? Just playing Minecraft for a few hours or days and building something like that?
I have wanted to do tutorials on it for sure. Yeah, it's on my list.
Yeah, I would definitely watch that. And going more into this low level topics would definitely also benefit me because I don't have enough knowledge there. But the problem for me, I have two problems with this. First of all, I would probably find it too boring. I already have problems getting through the clean code book from Bob, Uncle Bob. Bob Martin is his name, right? Or
Robert
Robert
Martin, yep.
Martin.
Uncle Bob,
Robert
yeah.
Martin. It's already difficult for me to get through this book. And the other problem is that doesn't it make it difficult to keep up with the changes in the higher level topics, because the programming landscape is changing fast and I feel like I'm already completely um, I already need all my time to just keep up with this. So learning these lower level topics, it feels like I don't have the time for this. I don't really have a question for you regarding this, but this is just my problems and the reasons why I don't do this at the moment. Or do you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And one of the things people who follow my channel probably have noticed is that I've stopped using a lot of new Android libraries. I will only use, and it's not just Android. Nowadays, I will only use a library if I believe it solves more problems for me than it creates. And a big reason for that was because I've been spending a lot more time learning these low level topics. So a great example would be like Kotlin flows. I'm perfectly comfortable building asynchronous Android applications without using Kotlin flow. So it's not something that it's definitely something I would learn given the time, but I wasn't a big fan of RxJava, so it's not like I want to recreate that in Kotlin to begin with. But that would be an example of something that I literally haven't learned that because I don't feel like I have the time to do it. So I think that's absolutely true. And I think the one thing I would say for anyone listening, who a good topic that most people avoid and I avoided because it was boring and not presented in a way which was useful, would be software engineering. I'm not going to give a big, huge lesson on software engineering, of course, but the one thing I would say to people is if you want to make software engineering relevant and interesting to you, you have to understand when it becomes relevant. The truth is that for many, many applications, like especially smaller applications and demo applications, you can have zero knowledge of formal software engineering and build great applications. Where software engineering gets really important is when the size of your user base, for example, is enormous, the size of data sets are enormous, or when the time it takes to do some operation in your code gets really large potentially. That's what software engineering is all about, is how do I rewrite this code where it takes less time to execute or it's more efficient with respect to memory. But those sorts of things aren't relevant for many, I would say the majority of applications which people write. But if anyone was wondering, why does Google, why does Amazon, why do Facebook give you these insane, like they just fire a barrage of these questions at you, is that they're dealing with data sets of like millions and potentially billions of items. So in that situation, software engineering is incredibly important, and it can mean the difference between a completely useless application and an efficient application. So hopefully for people listening, that might be an interesting little thing about why they barrage you with these questions. And also, if you think of building an application that has potentially a big user base, that can be an area where you can start to maybe focus your approach and learning in.
So you recommend to people who want to work at companies basically to definitely learn also the slower level stuff.
Software engineering in particular, I mean, I'm not sure how much they're going to quiz you on computer science concepts specifically, but definitely I've applied to several of the big companies. I actually did well in a Facebook interview just as COVID was happening, and then they denied me. I didn't get the third interview because they didn't want to sponsor me for a visa. So I was really pissed about that. But anyways, yeah. If you're going to be applying to one of these large companies, they're going to give you all kinds of questions about software engineering, data structures and algorithms, and what's called big O complexity. And so if you're going to apply to those places, you really want to understand those core concepts.
Yeah, this is probably, or this is one of the reasons why I didn't really need to learn this yet, because I'm not planning at the moment to apply to any of these companies. So maybe I can get away with ignoring some of the lower level stuff, but it would definitely be interesting. And yeah, you already mentioned that you don't use most Jetpack libraries. This was also something I noted down, which I have noticed from your videos. You don't use most Jetpack libraries, right? You build the stuff yourself. Also, for example, you don't use Jetpack view models. You build your own view models.
Yeah, that's there's some specific reasons for that. So part of it is that so all code changes over time, of course. So you've got, for example, a language which will change over time. You've got maybe like the standard library for that language, so kstdlib or jstdlib, which will also slowly change over time. Then you've got a platform which will change over time. And then you've got like sort of platform libraries / third-party libraries, which will change over time. So all of these things generally, in the order I listed them, will change slower. So obviously third-party libraries like and stuff like Jetpack, these things change all the time, very frequently. Like some of them are obsolete a year or two after they're made. So by using less of those libraries, my code becomes more resistant to change over time. And that's been nicer as a content creator, because then I can have something which isn't obsolete in 6 months or whatever. And that's been really frustrating, especially initially. So that's part of it. The other thing is that I am very much an advocate of testing and test-driven development, with the exception that my opinion is that most classes, well, I don't think it's even really my opinion, this is almost just a fact, classes which are tightly coupled to frameworks and platforms, so here I'm thinking of like a view, like a fragment or an activity, by way of their tight coupling, and if you're wondering what I mean by tight coupling, anyone watching this, look at the import statements in a class, and that will tell you what something's coupled to. Tight coupling necessarily makes something more difficult to test. A pure Java or a pure Kotlin class is easy to test. You don't even really need something like JUnit. You could write a main function, give it some data, and then write some little class to see what its output is. I don't necessarily suggest you do that. I do use JUnit, but I don't even use a mocking library these days. So by not using, by keeping frameworks and platforms as isolated as possible, it also makes the other classes potentially reusable across multiple platforms. And secondly, it makes them a lot easier to test, generally speaking. In the case of view model, I should say, Android view model is basically a Jetpack view model that has a reference to context. In the case of view model or Android view model, those libraries don't really solve as many problems as they create for me. It means I need to create them. If hopefully this hasn't changed since last time I looked, but it means I need to use like view model providers to create them, so their instantiation is no longer directly controlled. I'm pretty sure you can hook it up with like Hilt or something, but I can't directly instantiate them myself in my own dependency injection code. And the other thing is that, for example, like live data with Compose now, I'm actually pretty comfortable just writing my own observer pattern, my own observables essentially, or just having like a Kotlin function type that my view binds to. It gives it a lambda, which gives me the same effect as like a live data. So really my lens with which I view every library these days is, can I write it myself simpler, and does that create more benefits? Or is it something where if I tried to write it myself, then it's going to either be a gigantic time vampire on something I'm not really interested in learning. So a great example, am I going to be writing my own Vue library? Am I going to write my own Compose or my own Vue system with XML? Hell no. I hate UI programming because I know how annoying and mathematical and technical it is. So I have zero interest in doing that. Am I going to write my own version of like retrofit? Probably. So it depends on a lot of different factors, learning goals, longevity, ease of testing. So that's kind of where my current approach is coming from.
Yeah, I'm always a bit scared of writing this stuff myself because there is quite a lot of stuff happening in the source code of these libraries, and there are a lot of details that I would be afraid of missing. For example, I wouldn't be sure if I handled the activity lifecycle properly. So what's your experience with that?
Oh, handling activity lifecycle.
I mean, in general, taking all these small details into account that these Jetpack libraries are, I mean, those are often written by multiple people over long periods of time. So I would be afraid that I'm missing a lot of details when I try to write this myself.
Yeah, it's tricky. And if you make the decision, I feel like maybe I'm wrong in this, but if you make the decision to go pretty lean on third-party libraries, you are going to have to own up to the fact that your presenter or your view model or whatever is going to have to be made aware somehow of lifecycle events like onStart. Like just a typical example in my current approach to architecture, whether I'm using a fragment or an activity as like a view container, in the onStart lifecycle or override function, lifecycle function, I will send an event. I basically represent UI events using a sealed class in Kotlin typically. I will send an onStart event immediately to my presenter. So I have to have my own ways of hooking into those sorts of life cycles. And one of the things you don't get using my approach, especially out of the box, is you have to be careful about how you're dealing with orientation changes or just situations where you're recreating the activity. You have to handle that stuff yourself. And that's a great example of something where a lot of the Jetpack libraries are really quite good at handling those things out of the box. So that's definitely an important consideration.
Yeah, but it's a useful skill to write this stuff yourself because these Jetpack libraries often have bugs and then you have to find a way to work around them, but you can't get into the source code. Has been a problem, for example, in the course I made. In this one paid course I made, that there were certain bugs that I couldn't really solve because those were alpha libraries, but people don't want to see the old stuff anymore, so I have to use these alpha libraries. But yeah, if you can write the stuff yourself, then you have more control over what exactly is happening.
Yeah, there's actually a specific moment where I got really sick of it, is actually with the early navigation library on Android. It might work great now. The early version I used, I ran into situations where the best way to use that library was to just not even use it. Like a great example was in a login feature. The way in my 2019 Android tutorial, the way I was able to build that app, the only way with that login feature was to literally just not use the library in the activity which had the login feature in it due to on-activity result. I don't know if they handle it better now, but when that happened, I thought to myself, like, I understand that this might work well in 80% of scenarios, but it irritates me that this thing just breaks my application if I try and use it. And the funny thing is, like, some people had these workarounds like this, sharing view models and stuff like that. And if it works, it works. But the workarounds were like worse than just not using it. So that was a real big shift.
Yeah, I think that's a common sentiment with Jetpack libraries. I think Gabor is also not a fan of Jetpack navigation. But you use Jetpack Compose, right? So you're fine with that. But there's not really any getting around this at this point.
Yeah, of Jetpack libraries, I really like Compose. I never really liked the XML system. I think probably if you had a background in web development and you did HTML, you probably loved the XML system. I hated it. For me, I don't know what it was, but obviously we had the design editor. I found almost invariably I would use the design editor to preview what I was doing, but most of the work I would be doing would be in XML. I'd be typing in the XML editor specifically, and I don't like XML. And to be honest, I think if you grew up writing high-level code in like Java, I don't see why you really would prefer to write something in XML. But I get it. Everyone's different. So I wasn't a big fan of the view system, and one of the interesting things, people would always complain about it, rightfully so. Like they'd complain about, for example, let's say you want to theme something. You had like this context compat thing that you had to wrap over top, what should be this simple function call. You had to jump through these hoops to do things that on the surface seemed very simple. In listening to the Android Developers Backstage podcast a couple of times, I gained a lot more appreciation for how annoying it is for the Android team and the platform engineers to be building on top of view system code that's literally like 10 years old. So a lot of those situations where something had this ridiculous boilerplate code to do something simple, it's because they were building on top of this ancient system. So I think one of the biggest selling points for Compose, apart from the fact that you're writing it purely in Kotlin, is that they are no longer tethered. They are to a certain degree. Like if you look through the memory space and the debugger, you will eventually see something that ties into the old view system. But overall, they don't have to build on top of this legacy code. And so that's one of the big selling points why Compose is able to do a lot of things a lot easier than the old view system, is because it's not building on top of this legacy code. It might be worth summarizing really quickly what Compose is for the few people who haven't tried it or heard it at all. So basically, you want to think of it as it's a UI framework like the view system. Now, instead of representing the views as XML tags, or you could do this programmatically, but most people used XML in Android. Instead of doing like XML tags that are nested within each other, we're actually writing what are called composable functions. So these are Kotlin functions annotated with the composable annotation. And essentially, you nest these composable functions within each other in the same way that you nest XML tags within each other. And that's sort of how you build and structure your user interface. So you're doing pretty much everything in Kotlin. You can do your theming, your colors, all this kind of stuff in the Kotlin language. So for someone who really prefers Kotlin over, for example, XML, being able to do these things in Kotlin is really wonderful. There's a bit of a learning curve to it. So it takes some time to just be comfortable working with lambdas in particular, lambda expressions. But once you get over that hump, it's pretty spectacular. Now, if I could say one more thing about this really quickly, I get asked a lot, should I learn Compose right now? And this is probably coming from someone who's worried about getting a job or something like that. I would say if you're trying to get hired by a specific company and they don't make any mention of Compose, I'd probably still focus on the view system. If you have extra time, you can learn Compose. It's a new library. It is stable, but there's still quirks with it, and it's new enough that it's gonna be a while before many companies adopt it, because people are resistant to change. People like the things they're used to. So it's not necessarily something you should learn right away as like a primary learning goal. If you're like, I want to get hired as an Android developer, tell me exactly what I should focus on. But with that being said, if you look at the company you're trying to apply to, or the companies, they mention Compose, consider learning it. And if you have the spare time and you're interested in it, definitely learn it.
Yeah, it will take a while until Compose has completely taken over. But it's interoperable with XML, so it's not like a company has to rewrite the whole app in order to use Compose. They can start right away. So I think it makes sense for most people to at least look into it and start learning it on the side at the moment. But yeah, if you want a job, then it's probably still more important to know XML, because there's a lot of XML code around. I also like Compose. I agree that it has a steep learning curve. It's not as easy as Google tries to make it look. They often say it's so easy and simple, but it isn't. And handling state and everything can be trickier. But I already noticed that it makes it less likely to introduce bugs into the code. For example, because when you have a checkbox, for example, then you have to pass as a Boolean value if this checkbox is checked or not. Whereas before in XML, the checkbox had its own internal state. So if you put it into your layout, you can click it and it was on and off, but it wasn't bound to any specific representation in your code, to any Boolean value necessarily. So it was possible that your checkbox was checked, but the checked value in your view model, for example, was not actually true. So there was two sources of truth basically. And this is different in Compose. When the checkbox is checked, then I know that the corresponding value in my view model is also true, the corresponding Boolean. And this makes it less likely to introduce bugs. At least this is my experience so far. I like it. It's also kind of addictive. It's harder to build complicated layouts, I think, because you don't have this nice constraint layout editor like in XML where you can just drag and drop these boundaries and these connections to different views. So far I've only built rather simple layouts with rows and columns and weights for these different composables. But yeah, this is also just practice. And what annoys me at the moment is that the previews are so slow. So you have to create these special functions that you annotate with add preview. So those are also composable functions, but they are really slow at the moment, right?
They're terrible, yeah.
Yeah, they need quite in a small app, it's actually faster for me to start the app and navigate to the screen rather than reloading the preview. It's actually faster for me. Of course, it's not the case anymore in big apps that need a while to compile, but in smaller apps, and the app I have on the Play Store, I'm actually faster starting the app and navigating to this particular screen than reloading the preview in Android Studio.
Yeah, that's true. I did want to mention one thing. There is a constraint layout in Compose. It's a separate layout, but it does take a little while to learn. With that being said, I actually find the Compose constraint layout easier to sort of set up, or more concise, is a better way of saying it. Not necessarily easier, but more concise than the XML one. But I totally agree. The learning curve is difficult, and you really have to play around with separation of concerns and using helper functions and not writing giant composables. And that's really tough to do at first.
Yeah, I agree. For beginners, I don't really know how easy this will be in the future to get started with Android, because I find it quite difficult, actually. And as you already said, you also have to know about lambdas and also about coroutines. For example, showing a snack bar now requires a coroutine, right? If I remember correctly. A lot of this basic stuff requires quite advanced language features already. But maybe that's a good thing, because you will need them earlier or later anyway. I don't know. Time will tell if beginners can handle this or not. I just hope that they make the preview faster.
I'm 100% agree.
And you already mentioned before that Kotlin is your favorite programming language. So people are still asking if they should learn Java or Kotlin for Android. So what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I've been getting that question.
As a beginner, even if Kotlin is nicer, maybe for beginners it makes still sense to learn Java first.
Yeah, I get that question like literally every live stream these days. I haven't been doing too many up until like a week ago. So let's say I'm a beginner and I'm most probably primarily concerned about getting a job. Should I learn Kotlin or Java? So the only situation at this point, I wouldn't have said this 2 years ago, but at this point, in my opinion, there's only one reason why you would prefer to learn Java over Kotlin. If you're trying to get hired by a specific company and they specifically say they still do things in Java, that would be a reason to prefer Java. Now, it's helpful to learn about the JVM, which can be quite a technical topic, whether you're learning Java or Kotlin. At this stage, the problem with learning, say, the basics of Java before Kotlin is that you're going to get used to... Listen, I love Java. It's my first programming language where I wrote significant code. The syntax is terrible and verbose. It just sucks.
Yes.
I love it, but it sucks. So you're going to be picking up all these bad habits and you're going to be memorizing this terrible Java syntax. And then probably when you start writing Kotlin, you're going to be like trying to map that to Kotlin. And that was one of the problems I had when I started with Kotlin, is I was basically trying to write Java in Kotlin. And when you really get used to writing Kotlin, you really are able to write like 40, sometimes 60% less lines of code in order to do the same thing that you would do in Java. So that would really be the only situation where I would recommend learning, say, Java. If you had to pick one of the two, if you're doing Android development, I think most companies that aren't just gigantic legacy Java code bases full of people who hate change, which if that's the case, then you should find a different career because programming changes all the time. But those companies, I'm sure they exist. If it's not one of those companies, I think it's better to learn Kotlin, especially for Android, because you're going to be a lot more productive. And over time, I do think for most JVM type applications that Kotlin will become more popular. Admittedly, they just recently added sealed classes to Java in like Java 17, so maybe Java will catch up. But for Android, I do recommend Kotlin.
Yeah, they're adding a lot of this stuff to Java. Also records, I think, which are similar to data classes.
Yeah.
But on Android, I would, as a beginner, just learn Kotlin now, unless, as you say, you have a special reason because you want to get hired at a specific company. But what people also have to understand is that Kotlin is also easier, at least in my opinion, on Android at least, because if you want to use these Jetpack libraries, they're all optimized for Kotlin now. They are just easier to use in Kotlin.
Yeah, it's important to understand that Kotlin is a modern programming language, and that is an important distinction because Java, I think it's around the same age as I am, or maybe I'm like slightly older than Java, and that comes with a lot of, like I say, clunky, verbose syntax and some approaches which are maybe not so optimal. I think one thing to point out in particular, Java has been trying to add this stuff in, but some of the sort of, I don't want to say properly functional, but functional style features of Kotlin, when you get comfortable with them, are very, very useful. A perfect example is, for example, Kotlin's function types. I use them all the time now. Like in my view models, in my composables, my composables actually observe function types, and they pass a lambda into the view model, and that's how I actually completely replaced live data for my composables and compose apps. So, yeah.
Yeah, something I sometimes have a bit of trouble understanding because I'm lacking the fundamental knowledge for this is why are there certain things in a language like Java that can be changed in hindsight, like they can add these records or they can add sealed classes, but, and this is probably a very dumb question, but why can't they change other stuff? Why can't they get rid of these getter and setter methods in hindsight? Or what is a different example? What makes Java verbose?
Well, things like typecasting, types in general tend to be a lot clunkier, semicolons, lack of single expression syntax.
Right, and my question is, you know more about this computer science basic stuff. Why can't they change this in hindsight? Why can't they go back and change this? Because projects break, right? They need to provide backwards compatibility.
I'd have to speculate a bit. So please understand this is speculation for people listening, but I think it would be a combination mostly of two things. One of them would be, as you said, let's say I wanted to change, like let's say I wanted to get rid of the semicolon. Like in Kotlin, semicolons are optional, whereas in Java, obviously you need them if you've ever written a Java application. So one approach could be to make them optional, and that's if I was going to do that change, that I think that would be the most sensible way. But some small little change, like you just said, could potentially break legacy code bases. So whenever it's interesting. Obviously, I haven't worked on a language as big as Java or something like that, but a very interesting thing that I've been dealing with making this pretty small language. Like I have 3 basic types. I don't have classes, and I probably won't, although I'll probably make tuples. One of the interesting things that I've experienced in a small way with language design and development is that some tiny little change can have this cascading effect of complexity on the compiler and the language capabilities and all these sorts of things. The other thing that I would assume is a big factor, there's a saying I heard in physics, which is that physics as a field advances funeral by funeral. So the people who are kind of at the top of the food chain have a lot of authority, and they might have very fixed opinions, maybe. I'm not saying that's definitely the case with the people who are responsible for designing and maintaining Java, but I suspect that's probably also a big factor, is that people tend to be resistant to change, and you'd have to have a really good reason to convince someone like that to make any kind of a change, because the attitude is like, well, it already kind of works. I've built amazing applications. Why should we change? So I think it would probably be a combination of those two things. But with that being said, there's certain things in Java, like a great example is default methods in interfaces. I had this beautiful way of explaining, and I still basically explain it this way, the difference between inheritance, interfaces, and an abstract class. I should say class inheritance. And I have this beautiful way of explaining exactly when to use each of these things and what they do and blah, blah, blah. And the one thing that throws a wrench in my explanation is Java's default methods. So just really quickly, a default method is an implemented method you can put in an interface. Now, when I was creating a course on Java, I was trying to understand, like, why did they add this? Like, this is totally contrary to the purpose of an interface, which is a very abstract kind of thing. And then I found out that the reason why they implemented it is it's like some handy little thing that's supposed to help people working on ancient legacy code bases add something into like some class that inherits from the interface. So it's funny that they're like resistant to, I get it that they're resistant to like changing the structure of the language, but some of the things that get added in, you would think they could really make some improvements. I don't know.
It's interesting that you said that in your programming language that you are building, that making changes already had a big cascading effect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, then this is probably an important point, that changing something that was already used somewhere, or that's not just adding something new on top, but changing something that already exists, is probably always much more difficult than one would imagine it.
Yeah, anytime there's legacy code involved, you have to be very concerned about that.
Do you have any general tips on choosing an architecture for your app? And I think I already know your answer because I've been watching your videos. Your approach basically is that there is no one right architecture. Instead, you should use whatever you need at this point in time, which makes sense. But do you have anything to add to this? Do you have any preference when it comes to architecture, like MVVM, MVI, clean architecture? Do you have any preferences, or how do you approach this?
Yeah, well, you gave away my punchline, which is fine. So the most common question I'm asked, period, is what is the best architecture? Usually they just ask, like, is MVVM the best architecture? So it's worth spending just a moment explaining why there's no such thing as the best architecture for every situation. It's not MVVM, or it might be. It's not MVI, or it might be. It's not MVP, or it might be. Maybe it's MVP VM. Maybe it's Viper architecture. Who knows? So I'd like to explain this first using a non-technical analogy, and hopefully the people listening to this understand that there's a reason why I chose this analogy. And there's a reason why the same things you will see in building architecture are observed in software architecture. So let's say we're architects and we are designing an apartment and we have specific requirements. We're designing an apartment for a family with 2 adults and 1 child. So we can have some debate about how to design this thing, but it's probably going to need a bedroom. It's probably going to need a bathroom. Probably 2 bedrooms would be good for some privacy, if you know what I mean. And then it's going to have a kitchen, probably, and then maybe a living room if it's like upper middle class or something like that. So we have like this general idea of things we're definitely going to need. And like I say, we can have some debates about what's the best situation. Maybe the preferences of the people you're designing it for might come into account. But we're talking about ways of sort of setting up the same general thing. Now, if we were to arrive hypothetically at the best architecture for an apartment for 2 adults and 1 child, would it make sense to then extrapolate that and say that this is the best architecture for building a car factory? No. So the point of that analogy is to kind of explain to people the project requirements dictates the best architecture for the project, and that can change a lot. To get slightly more technical here, let's talk about 2 different ways to do MVVM, because if you thought there was only one way to do MVVM, you're wrong. So 2 different ways. In the first approach, our view model exposes just a data model, like a note, a user, a shopping cart, just raw data, no details about the view which is observing that view model. The benefit of this approach is that it makes your view models reusable across a series of different views. There could be some other benefits, but that's kind of the main one, is reusability. And that's what most people think of, and that was something that was marketed a lot, I think, by the Android team, forgive me if I'm wrong, as a primary reason why they chose model view model architecture. Now, interesting thing that you'll also see in some of their code bases, and this is something I figured out pretty quickly. Another way to do model view model, and this is how Martin Fowler approached it in his article. I think it was called like presentation model or something. And I think this is sort of where MVVM was originally derived from, but it doesn't really matter. Again, the view is observing the view model. So that's the one common thing you should see in MVVM architecture, is the view observing the view model. And the view model may not have a reference to the view. That's common. In the second approach, the view model has a field or a property or some kind of observable thing, a live data thing, for every UI element in that particular view. So in other words, it's still not tightly coupled to that view in terms of like import statements, but in terms of presentation logic, it is tightly coupled to the details of that particular view. So the benefit of this approach is that you can basically pull almost all of the presentation logic out of that view, which is going to make it very simple, easier to test if you want to test it. And in my opinion, I really hate filling views full of logic, but I understand if you have a really good UI testing setup, then you can do that. So the important thing to understand here is that these 2 things, reusability and knowing about the presentation details of a particular UI screen, are, to use a fancy word they like to use, orthogonal. They move in different directions. So if I was to say the approach of using reusable view models is the best way to do MVVM, if I say that in a situation where I never need to reuse a view model, and I'm basically choosing that and then filling my views full of presentation logic, I would be using a suboptimal architecture. Conversely, if I use the other approach in a really simple view which barely has any presentation logic to begin with, and I might have another view which really could use that same view model, I'm also not using the optimal architecture. So the most important thing to understand is that there's no such thing as the best architecture for specific situations. And then secondly, the more specialized an architecture is for a certain situation, it'll tend to be or specialized for when an architecture is really good in some situations, there's almost definitely going to be some situations where it's much worse than a more generalized architecture. So my current approach, as you kind of mentioned, so generally it'll look like MVP VM, but if I have a feature where there's almost zero presentation logic, I'll just leave out the presenter because I don't need it. If I have a feature where I don't need to store anything temporarily to render the view, then I might leave out the view model. So I try to base my architecture on the project requirements at hand. And for those listening who might not have that knowledge of when to use what, the honest truth is you just need to try different architectures in different situations, and then you start to get a sense of what works good in what situation. Two things to really focus on for MVVM, like I said, though, is the complexity of the view and reusability, and that can really help you figure out what approach to use.
Yeah, in the app I'm building right now, I also try to be just pragmatic. I started with what I consider MVVM, and then I just add stuff, or maybe go more towards clean architecture when I actually need it. So this is also a benefit of building your own app. You don't do this stuff just because the theory tells you to use them. You use the stuff that actually makes sense in this situation, because you want your app to work, and you want to be able to get back at a later time and continue working on this code without getting completely confused. So this is how I approach it at the moment. But I didn't know that view models are actually reused. Do people actually reuse view models? How does this work? You have two screens with the same kind of data. In your first example, where you expose just the raw data, basically.
Well, let's say we had like fragment A and fragment B, and they were both dependent on a specific data model, say like a specific user object. That might be a situation where you would want to have that reusable view model, because then you can potentially share it between fragment A and fragment B. If the view model is tightly coupled to the presentation logic of fragment A, you might not be able to reuse it in fragment B, essentially.
Yeah, I think the second approach to me seems to make more sense, where you don't expose the raw types. But I think I am still using more the first approach, where the viewer is maybe doing a little bit too much work. I mean, there's not much logic in my views, but I think I could prepare the data better. But yeah, it doesn't really matter here. This is just my specific case. Yeah.
It is tricky. Like what people should understand is that 3 layers, that is a useful generalization that should be deviated from pretty quickly. Like if I was to really break down things, it would probably be 5 layers. And again, not every feature is going to have this. You've got the thing that draws the screen, which is generally the view. You've got how to draw that screen, which is the presentation logic. You've got the data necessary to draw that screen and probably store temporarily, which is kind of what I think of as a view model. You've got the thing that accesses the data. Sometimes that's a presenter or a view model. You've got the thing that stores the data, and then you have the logic required to wire all that stuff up, which is what we think of as like dependency injection or service locator. So even in like a moderately complex app, what I usually see is a necessary separation of about 5-6 things. Not always the case. And if I'm in a situation where I don't actually need to pull all of these things out, I might not. You have to be pragmatic, and I do agree that premature optimization can be a waste of time. But I think if I was to basically explain what are the elements of a GUI architecture that you should really pay attention to, it would be those 6 things.
Yeah, so if people want to learn more about this architecture stuff and your approach to this, I recommend that they watch your videos, because you make a ton of content about exactly these topics, right?
Yeah, every one of my courses is like, I'll teach you some like building an application, but in every course I teach, the architecture stuff is right up front, and you actually build the architecture and see how it fits together.
Okay, so I will put all these links into the show notes. Here on YouTube, this will be the description, but later when I upload the audio version of this podcast, this will be the show notes. This is what they are called there. Okay. And you also told me that you already have some experience with Kotlin multiplatform, but no experience with Flutter yet. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how do you like Kotlin multiplatform, how it worked out for you, if there were any problems you ran into, and even though you haven't used Flutter yet, what do you think about these cross-platform solutions in general? Because people are often worried that cross-platform like Flutter will make native obsolete. Do you think this is a worry that's justified?
So here's an important thought to me that came to me a couple of years ago. I was listening to I think Elon Musk on Joe Rogan or something like that, and he said something which I think it had to do with Neuralink, which made me realize, in my opinion, exactly what is stopping the floodgate of cross-platform development, the technical limitation. And so this might be a useful thing to mention for people who are wondering if they need to jump into cross-platform development. So in my opinion, where the floodgate will open is when satellite internet probably, is fast enough that the time it takes for me to press a button on my device and for that to be handled by the CPU is comparable for the time it takes for me to press a button to it'd still be handled by the CPU, but instead of it being handled by the application on this phone, it's sent through the internet to a cloud application. So for those who are wondering, the cloud means someone else's computer. There's no cloud. So anyways, that time delay and the freedom of access to internet that fast and latency that low, in my opinion, will dictate the transition between when these things will basically just become view renderers and all the rest of the application will be hosted on a server, for example. So I think that's why. So we don't have that yet. Most of us, certainly not the majority of users, in my opinion. And that's why native is still flourishing and developing. And it actually pisses me off when people say things like Android is dead. It's like 4 billion users is dead. Like, what a dumb statement that is. Sorry, I'm getting angry. So returning to the question, I think that's the limitation and why I've been interested in looking at something either cross-platform or something that is primarily dealt with through the browser, which potentially includes things like React. Why I've been interested in that is I do think native does kind of have a shelf life based on what I just said there. I think once we have really low latency internet that's freely accessible for the majority of mobile users, it just simply won't make sense to have a lot of the stuff that we have on here. Now, talking about KMM and Flutter. So my own experience with KMM, I've built an application which has an Android front end with Compose, and it is a KMM project. I'm planning to add in a JavaScript, so a Kotlin JS front end and a Compose desktop front end at the moment. So I don't have a ton of implementation experience on my own projects. I have been doing code review with a friend of mine who's building a Kotlin multi-platform mobile project, which also includes machine learning, which is really cool. So I have a little bit of experience with it. What I see so far in my initial experiences are that I'm very, very excited because I think my approach of being very lean on third-party libraries is actually going to make it so that a lot more of my code base is reusable across multiple different front ends. So for example, I think I can share hopefully both my presentation logic classes and my view models, and possibly even the composables across different modules. So I'm very, very excited about it. Here's the problem. Configuring Gradle for a Kotlin multi-platform module has been a nightmare, both in my project and in this other project I was working on. I contributed this one little change where I basically pulled the Compose theme into a common module, and it took me like 16 hours to get that to work, even though I only changed like a line of code and just copied some files from one module, Gradle module, I should say, into another Gradle module. It took me like 16 hours just to get the Gradle to build. So the biggest limitation I see at the moment for Kotlin multi-platform mobile is Gradle configuration. Maybe part of that is there's just not good up-to-date examples, but that was a complete nightmare. I'm very excited about it though, because like I say, Kotlin is my favorite programming language. And I think with my sort of third-party third-party library lean approach to building applications, I think that'll translate really well. People ask me a lot about Kotlin multi-platform versus Flutter versus React. And my limited experience with most of these things is that they share something common, which is that they'll work pretty well for most use cases across the multiple platforms. And then when they need to interact with like the device at a lower level, they tend to be really, really obnoxious. So I think you should understand that, or people should understand that generally speaking, a multi-platform solution is going to come with benefits and trade-offs essentially. So the benefits hopefully are shared code across multiple different code bases. Even just being able to write in the same language might be useful to you. But the deficits are that you're generally speaking going to lose some fine-grained control and access to the libraries on the native device, for example. So that's kind of my general thoughts. I really don't agree and don't think that native is dead. And I think if you want to start learning Android now, whether it's with Flutter or with Kotlin or whatever, I think that's a great way to do it. Or I think it's still a very valid career path. And there's people who make videos about this kind of thing, that Kotlin is, or native is dead, and then their followers regurgitate that, and then I get angry at them. But there's still a lot of jobs out there for Android developers, even in Java, because there's a lot of legacy code bases. So for that kind of thing, for someone listening to this, go with what interests you and don't worry too much about whether it's going to be obsolete, because the skills you're going to pick up in learning Flutter or learning Kotlin Android or even Kotlin Java, those are going to translate into other fields of programming.
Yeah, I agree. When you learn one of these platforms, then you can just switch to another one later if it really becomes obsolete, which for native Android will most likely not be the case very soon. Just to quickly explain the difference between Kotlin multi-platform and Flutter, if some people don't know, it's not quite the same. Flutter is a real cross-platform framework where you basically build one app and it works on iOS and Android. And the downside of this is that it's not very close to the metal, right? You have to, you get problems as soon as you need more low-level stuff, like, I don't know, Bluetooth or media player or stuff like that. On Flutter, I think you need plugins for that. I have no first-person experience with Flutter yet, because I haven't tried it out yet, just because didn't really have the time, didn't really interest me. But Kotlin multi-platform is a bit different. There you share code between iOS and Android, but then you also have specific platform-specific code. So you have to actually get a Mac and Xcode and write iOS-specific UI code. And the same for Android with Android Studio. And you just have the core part in the middle. Basically, there's shared logic that both platforms use. And what you save is you don't have to write this shared logic twice. But I think the benefit of KMM is that you are still very close to the platform. So you can do all the stuff you can do in a native app, I think, because you write this Android and iOS specific code. So this is a bit of the difference between Flutter and KMM. For me personally, I find KMM more interesting at the moment. But if I would try to build a real app that doesn't need any of these low-level features, that's basically just an app that handles some database operations and needs to look nice, then I would, and it was important for me that this app is a financial success. Or no, this is the wrong way to phrase it. I don't want to say that Flutter makes your app a financial success. I just mean that it's a real product that I want to get out there as quickly as possible. And it's a simple app, then I would probably try out Flutter for that. But for anything that's more complicated, I find KMM more interesting. And you said that it's a bit painful to set up with Gradle, but I think they will streamline this more in the future, won't they? So
I do think so.
Yeah. So just as we can start a project in Android Studio and it just works, I think it will also be easier in the future when you start a new KMM project, because there are templates for that in IntelliJ, right?
Yes.
For KMM.
As some precedents there, so a great example is I was very late in adopting Gradle KTS, which is being able to write Kotlin instead of Groovy in Gradle. And the reason why I was late in adopting it was because the people who I was familiar with who were using it said it was super annoying and buggy. The one thing that wasn't an issue at all for me in this latest project that I was working on was Gradle KTS. They had ironed out all the kinks there. It was like the plugins and stuff like that that were really annoying to configure. So I do think they'll streamline it quite a lot.
Okay, those were all the notes that I have written down for the more technical stuff. Or is there anything to add? Is there anything else you wanted to talk about when it comes to the more technical stuff, Android and things like that?
I'm pretty happy with what we've covered there. Nothing's really jumping out at me.
Yeah, for me neither. Then the only thing left is that we wanted to touch a bit more on meditation, because I mean, most people will close the video now if they haven't yet. But I personally am also a big fan of meditation, and I actually meditate between 45 minutes and 1 hour every single day I haven't skipped a day in over 2 years.
That's
when
awesome,
When I started this. Well, okay, but I'm also a person who doesn't have a very exciting life, so I don't do a lot of interesting stuff, but I like it like this.
That's a good thing.
Way. Yeah, it also has a few downsides, but this is just how I feel the best. Yeah, why do you meditate? What are the benefits you get out of this? And maybe how much do you meditate? How often and for how long?
Sure. There was a number of very formative experiences I had. One of them being that story I told earlier, where when I was solving that shuffle algorithm, my mind was still for a moment. Excuse me, sorry. My mind was still for a moment, and that was a very unique experience. My natural sort of mental state is my mind constantly analyzing everything and constantly asking questions. And I have what I would say a very overactive imagination, and it's very like 3D. So I spent a lot of my time in classes not paying attention to lectures, but basically just imagining worlds in my head kind of thing. And that had some very negative side effects. I think that's probably why I can visualize an entire software architecture and the flow of information in my head. But the bad thing is that stuff was still happening when I would be like talking to someone. And unfortunately, if 90 to 80% of your CPU is analyzing things or imagining things or worrying about what the other person says or how they're judging you or all these sorts of things, you're going to have very messed up communication with other human beings. As opposed to what I'm doing right now, which is I'm not thinking about whether I'm doing a good job on this podcast. I'm not thinking about whether I'm saying something stupid. I'm just in this present moment, letting the words flow out, and whatever happens, happens. So anyways, that was that first formative experience. The second formative experience, and this will sound weird to people, I started doing powerlifting in high school. And what made me love powerlifting is that just before I lifted a really heavy weight, moments before, my mind went absolutely quiet. Dave Tate, who's this famous powerlifter, calls it the void. So I would have a moment of pure stillness. My entire existence boils down to lift this weight. And my vision would basically, it's not that my vision would go dark, but I would stop paying attention to what I was seeing. And I would just focus in on lifting this heavy thing off the ground. So I had these two experiences of like, I want that. My mind shut up for a second because my mind was very out of control for most of all of my teenage years. The third experience I had wasn't what I would call a moment of stillness. I'm going to avoid using the Buddhist jargon. I'll try and use some basic English words. Those moments of stillness, the third experience I had, I was working as a suit salesman, a fine clothing salesperson. Now, you've got to understand, I'm an introvert. I wore very plain clothing. So it's a funny story how I ended up in this job, but you've got to understand that it was a very unnatural environment because I'm an extreme introvert who doesn't know how to dress, trying to tell old rich people how to dress. The first 18 months or so of that job was horrendous. But after about 2 years, I finally got decent. And I had this experience with a customer where I was cracking jokes. And this is like a 65-year-old rich person. And I'm like at the time I was 18. I'm cracking jokes. I'm almost what you could call suave. Oh, that was a good voice crack. My mom says I can date girls soon. I was suave, not like I was moments ago. I was loose. I was laughing. I had a great sale. I sold him a couple $100 worth of pants or something like that. And I felt great interacting with a stranger. After the sale, which took about 40 minutes, I walked into the back and some part of my mind said, "Who was that? You're not like that." And then, so I kind of, it stopped me for a second because I'm like, wait a minute. This is completely outside my character and personality. I'm never like that. And then a second sort of thought popped into my head. If that's not you, who else could it be? So the short version of the story is that I realized in that moment that the ego is basically a made-up abstraction of memories and conditioning and all these sorts of things. And if you think if you think you are your ego, essentially, your BS ideas about yourself and the other BS ideas that other people force on you, it's BS. And that was a very important experience because it untethered me from believing my own thoughts too closely because I knew that they were inaccurate, potentially. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to put that experience into context, and I wasn't meditating, so I was still miserable for like 2 years after that. When I was around 21 years old or 20, I'm 27 now, just about to turn 28, I was looking for some way to get back to that stillness, and the thing that jumped out at me is probably some of you people are aware of an image of a Vietnamese, I believe, Buddhist Theravada monk who self-immolated, which is a big fancy word for he had gasoline poured all over himself, lit a match, burned himself alive.
Yeah, there's a Wikipedia article about this if people are interested. It's called The Burning Monk, I think.
Yeah, and I looked at that and yeah, on a certain level, it's a pretty horrific image, but I thought to myself, I can't sit down and do nothing for like 5 minutes. And this fellow sat there, burned himself alive and didn't move. I need to know what's going on there. That's how it started. Unfortunately, so I'm a very scientifically critical-minded person, and the community I went to school in, Salt Spring it's called, is full of hippies, And so I really have an aversion to pseudo spiritual, love the world, namaste, dude, West Coast crap. And I still have some aversion to that. So the first couple of resources I learned at really didn't appeal to me. And I understand that was my conditioning working, and that actually, there was still some useful information in that stuff, but I wasn't ready to hear it. My favorite person at the time, my favorite thinker, was Sam Harris. And he was known as being like one of the most famous atheists on the planet. Now, if you're religious, I'm cool with you, okay? No anti-religion stuff here, but that's what he's known for. But he also meditated. And I thought to myself, why is the most critical and skeptical thinker I've ever come across meditating? To condense a lot of experience, I started with Sam Harris's early guided meditations many, many years ago, and they helped a little bit, but I needed a lot more help than that. Eventually, I came across some teachers in a school of Buddhism which is called Theravada Buddhism. And I don't think it really matters which one. They all typically point to the same things. I came across a teacher who, for the first time ever, explained the meditation process in a way that made sense to me and gave me a way to do it. Because a lot of early resources I had found said, sit in an uncomfortable position. Even if in your culture, you never sit cross-legged ever, sit cross-legged so you're uncomfortable as heck, to avoid the expletive, and then focus on your breathing or whatever. Try not to think, which doesn't work. So again, to make a very long story quite a bit shorter here, for my first 4 years of meditation practice, I was doing like 10 to 20 minutes a day. Sometimes I would take months where I wouldn't do it at all. I would have some experiences of stillness. So stillness is or a flow state, your channel name, Coding in Flow.
Yeah, this is where this name is coming from, actually.
I figured I would have a flow state is basically what they call samadhi in Buddhism, or stillness. I call it functional stillness. That's my own name for it. Because it's weird in a certain way, nothing's happening, but everything is happening. Anyways, I'll shut up now. Things are just flowing through. So it would give me those, some moments of stillness, but overall I was just in a really stressful situation and my mind was still racing. Many years later, like 5 years later, something started to shift where parts of my conditioning and trauma started to sort of come up and then they would dissipate. It's very difficult to describe. And pretty much since then, on a good day, I meditate 30 minutes to an hour. I don't really have actually a daily sitting practice so much anymore, but I meditate a lot throughout the day in moments. Like, for example, it's something I've been trying to do while I've been talking to you periodically. So that's kind of been my experience lately. There's a lot more I could say, but I'm really curious to hear what your experiences are as well.
Yeah, so first of all, if people want to learn about meditation, the book I base my practice on is called The Mind Illuminated. I will put this into the description below. The author of this, who recently passed away only a few days ago, I think he had a history as a brain scientist. So the book has science in it. And also, as you said, Sam Harris is a really scientific guy. He's also into brain science stuff, right? I don't know what actually he does, but he
has a neuroscience PhD.
Okay. So this is also why I find these sources very interesting, because I'm also not a fan of this woo-woo stuff. I don't trust this, but I trust science. And meditation is playing a bigger and bigger role in science. And if people want to hear Sam Harris talk about meditation, there's a really nice video there's a clip of this somewhere on YouTube. Just type in Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, meditation. There's a clip where he explains the purpose of meditation, and he explains it really nicely. And he goes a bit into the difference between pain and suffering and what meditation can give you. So this is a great video, which I sometimes just watch again from time to time. And yeah, I started meditation like 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know how long exactly. And initially I started it because I hoped that it could help me with procrastination. And I guess it did a little bit, but it actually didn't have a real big effect on procrastination. I fixed procrastination with other means, like, as you mentioned earlier, with a schedule. But I still sticked to a meditation, even though it doesn't give me what I initially tried to get out of it. But it just so much makes sense to me. I also have naturally a very active mind, and I've always been someone who worries a lot. And I also remember times when I was younger, when I spent times with friends, that people would get really, or some people who didn't really know me would kind of get mad at me because I felt, some people thought I was really disinterested or really bored with a situation. But what was really happening was that my mind was always thinking about something else, just not the present moment. So I was always a bit in this bad state, and other people noticed that. And yeah, what meditation basically gives me, as you already said, it doesn't make your thoughts stop because they just pour out of your unconsciousness into your conscious mind. This just happens automatically. But they make you notice when you are lost in thought. It's like Sam Harris says, it's a bit like seeing your thoughts on a screen in front of you instead of directly in your head. It gives you this third person view on your thoughts. And this can be really useful because if you don't have this third person viewer, then what happens is the whole day are just thoughts coming up and you are getting lost in these thoughts. And this colors your whole experience the whole day. This is basically what happens. Thoughts are coming up and you are living through these thoughts. And getting this third party viewer basically lets you detach from this a little bit. It lets you notice, hey, this is just happening. It doesn't mean that this is me. It doesn't mean that I have to go through all these thoughts, or that I have to get lost in them, or that they have to control my. It's really not so easy to explain. So I recommend that people try it out. But it basically helps you being happier just by being a bit more in the present moment. And it also makes you less emotionally reactive because, again, you have this third person viewer on your own reaction, which gives you a moment that you can reconsider it. So someone says something to you and an angry thought pops into your head out of unconsciousness, and you get angry because your body physically, your heart starts racing or stuff like that. So you feel angry. And what normally happens is we immediately start being this angry person, immediately start living out this angriness, reacting angry, saying stuff that we regret later. And by having this third person viewer on this reaction, you notice, oh, this person said this, an angrier thought is coming up and I feel this in my body. And just being detached from this helps you to react much better, helps you to react much more objectively in the situation. I hope this makes sense to people. Again, they should just try it out, but you need patience for meditation. This is a bit of the downside of this. And I think this is a reason why so very few people actually do this. You need to do it for a while until it really starts showing its effects.
Oh yeah, it took me 4 years before I was actually meditating. Like for the first 4 years, I was pretty much just sitting there trying not to think and being very uncomfortable. And even in that, you can get some benefit, but eventually you will be able to properly meditate, and it's pretty indescribable how good it feels to need absolutely nothing to feel perfectly content in the present moment. And that was a very alien experience for me growing up with the people I grew up around. Substances and distraction was their way to feel good. And that's a horrible way to live.
Yeah, this is basically the real big goal when you do a real proper meditation practice, that you try to get to a state where you can be unconditionally happy, no matter how the world around you is. You're not searching for anything anymore. Now, this doesn't mean you have to just sit there and do nothing. You can actually still function in the world, but the present moment is perfect the way it is. And it's not dependent on your goals, for example, or when your next meal is, or if you have the right partner. It's unconditional, just in the present moment. And I think this is actually possible. I'm not in the state yet but I got some tastes of that where I was just like, okay, if I just for a moment don't try to, I don't know, think about these goals, or try to be present and accept the present moment as it is, then I got a little bit of a taste of this. Then I was sometimes just happy, because I realized that it's me striving for these external things that actually makes me impatient. It's not so much how the present moment is, because the present moment is mostly fine in most situations. But that you always want something, this is what really makes you unsatisfied. That happiness is always somewhere around the corner. We are never really satisfied. And this is ingrained in our DNA as humans, or as living beings, because this is how we survive, and this is how we build civilizations, by wanting more, by always wanting to get the next thing and the next thing. And this is how we are naturally wired. But if you don't do anything to get around this, or to mediate this, then you will always be unsatisfied, because dissatisfaction is what gets us forward in life. But it's important to control this a little bit, so that you can actually be happy at certain times.
If I may, I just want to add one little thing here, which hopefully might assuage some of the concerns for people. You might hear what Florian and I just said and worry, am I going to become unfeeling? Is that what you're saying? Or am I
hear
going
that
to
often.
Yeah, or am I going to lose my imagination? Because being able to imagine entire worlds in your head sounds pretty useful. Don't worry, those things are still going to be there. When it comes to like your faculties, you're actually going to be able to use them better. And the analogy I like to use for this is, you should imagine your brain like a CPU. So in an uncontrolled mind, your mind's at like 80 to 100% CPU constantly, and things need to compete for, processing power. After meditation, it's way down to like 10, 20%. If you're really deep, like 1%, 0%. When you need to use your imagination, you can use it. Don't worry, you didn't control it to begin with. It'll do its thing. And it'll have more free bandwidth to do what it needs to do. And then secondly, you won't become unfeeling. Quite the opposite. You will feel the present moment a lot more distinctly. What changes is you won't be so focused on reacting to the feelings, essentially like the ego impressions and the thoughts about the feelings. And those ego impressions and thoughts, when out of control, is the suffering, the psychological suffering of things. It's important to differentiate physical suffering with psychological suffering. But if you can just deal with the psychological suffering, then you're going to be a much happier person for it, in my opinion, my experience.
Yeah, often you said the difference between physical suffering and psychological suffering. I think the physical suffering is often just called pain, to differentiate between these two. So, for example, the book I mentioned, The Mind Illuminated, in the book, the author says, pain is inevitable when you are a living being, but suffering is completely optional. This is how he says it. So pain, either emotional or physical, is only the sensation, but suffering is your aversion to the sensation. So you can actually feel pain without suffering. But again, I'm not enlightened yet, so I still suffer. So when someone throws a hammer on my leg, then I still suffer. But apparently there is a difference between pain and suffering. And also the video from Sam Harris I mentioned earlier, he actually explains that theoretically someone could torture you physically and you could be able to not suffer from this. So you would have pain, but you would not suffer. Now, I don't know if there are any people on this world that actually reach this state, but some claim that they reach this state. And you mentioned the burning monk, right, who burned himself without screaming, I think. So it seems to be possible. But this is now we are at a point where people are probably thinking we are out of our minds. But for daily
Namaste,
life,
dude.
but for daily life, it's just nice to not be lost in thought all the time, and it will make you happier. And as Ryan already said, you don't have less good ideas just because you are not thinking in your head all the time, because ideas are actually coming out of the subconscious mind, not consciousness. So ruminating the same stuff over and over again, maybe this kicks off the but I think it doesn't actually have much of a purpose anyway. I think this conscious ruminating is not very useful in general, because your subconscious mind is actually doing the heavy lifting. It's coming up with the real solutions. This is also why you have the best solutions usually after waking up or after being at the gym for a while or going for a walk, because again, your subconscious mind is doing all the heavy lifting, all the important thinking.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, you don't become unfeeling. You just don't unnecessarily cling to certain feelings. So you are able to let them go. But it doesn't mean that you can never cry again when your family member dies or something like that. You're still a normal, you don't turn into a robot. You're still a normal person. And I sometimes compare not meditating or not having some kind of meditation practice. I think yoga also works, because yoga has some meditation elements in it. But I like to compare it a bit with not meditating is like not doing any physical exercise at all. You just basically hope that it works out. You don't train your mind. You just hope that you get through life the way it works by default. This is a bit like never exercising and just hoping that your body doesn't break. And I find it a very interesting topic, and there are many people I listen to that teach the stuff that don't try to sell anything at all. They don't even have a product they try to sell. There are certain people like that, like what was his name? His second name was Gary Rapper, I think. He is someone who makes videos about the stuff and presentations, but he doesn't have anything he wants to sell. Now, I think he has a book, but books are usually, they have a price because they need to be printed and everything. But it seems like there are a lot of people that I can trust in this topic, because I know they're not trying to sell me something. Anyway, I think this was enough about the topic of meditation, and I'm through my list here, and we are almost at 3 hours. So I think it's a good point to wrap it up, because this will be a pain to edit later.
Sorry, bro.
But it was a really nice discussion here. And unless there's anything else you want to add.
No, that's it. That's it from me. And I had a fantastic time chatting with you. This has been really fun. Thank you for having me on the show.
Me too. I just hope the recording worked properly.
Yeah, ich auch.
It's not lost. And I will put your links into the show notes. You can give me the links later that you want to put there, like your social links, website, blog, YouTube channel, and everything. And also to your paid courses if people want to check them out. I will put all of this into the show notes. And then I thank you for coming up in the show. It was really a pleasure.
Ja, vielen Dank, mein Freund. Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.